Hi guys, tonight you stand barefoot on cold stone. The kind of cold that doesn't shock you all at once but seeps upward, slowly claiming your souls, your ankles, your sense of time. Above your head, somewhere far beyond this moment, a medieval castle lives its ordinary life. Footsteps cross a hall. A door closes. Maybe someone laughs. You don't see any of it. You are already beneath it. A narrow opening yawns in front of you, half swallowed by shadow. It smells faintly of damp earth and old limestone, with a trace of smoke that never quite left. You hesitate, because your body understands something your mind is still catching up to. This space was not built for comfort. It was built to disappear. You step down. The light behind you thins almost immediately, shrinking into a pale stripe that crawls across the stone floor and then gives up. Down here, sound behaves differently. Every movement feels louder than it should be. Even though you know factually that medieval castle chambers beneath the ground were often insulated by several meters of packed earth and rock, making them surprisingly quiet from above. Still, your breath feels intrusive, as if the walls are listening. This is where the story really begins. Not in the Great Hall, not on the battlements, but here underneath everything that was meant to be seen. You probably won't survive this, at least not comfortably, and that's the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening late at night, maybe tell me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. There's something fitting about sharing darkness across distances. Now, dim the lights and let yourself move forward. You run your hand along the wall as you descend, fingers brushing stone that was cut slowly, patiently, by people who did not expect to be remembered for this work. Medieval builders didn't dig underground because it was clever or mysterious. They did it because the surface was dangerous. Fire could race through timber roofs. Siege engines could shatter walls. And people, especially people, were unpredictable. Historians broadly agree that by the High Middle Ages, most major castles included some form of subterranean space beyond simple cellars. That's the mainstream fact. What those spaces were for is where certainty begins to dissolve. The steps end, and you find yourself in a low chamber where the ceiling presses down just enough to make you straighten your spine unconsciously. You notice how the air feels thicker here, cooler, steadier. Underground temperatures stayed relatively constant year-round, something medieval builders understood intuitively long before anyone measured it with instruments. Summer heat dulled, winter cold softened, but comfort was never the primary goal. This chamber doesn't announce itself. No carvings, no symbols, just stone, earth, and silence. That in itself is telling. Above ground, castles were designed to impress. Below ground, they were designed to be forgotten. You imagine the moment this space was first hollowed out. No dramatic ceremony, just a few trusted workers, chosen carefully, digging by lamplight, iron tools scraping rock, earth hauled away in small loads so no one would ask why so much soil was missing. A quirky detail that survives in some records suggests spoil was sometimes scattered into gardens or dumped into rivers at night to avoid suspicion. It's a small thing, but it hints at a mindset secrecy as habit, not exception. You pause, listening. Nothing. That absence of sound is almost unsettling. Above you, life continues. Down here, time seems to thicken, stretching itself around you. This is what underground chambers offered that towers and walls never could removal. From noise, from sight, from expectation. Some scholars still argue whether these earliest hidden chambers were planned from the castle's first design or carved later in response to specific threats. The stone doesn't answer. It rarely does. You take a few slow steps forward, noticing how the floor slopes ever so slightly. That's not an accident. Medieval masons understood water long before they understood hygiene. Drainage mattered. Dampness could rot stored goods, rust weapons, make air unbreathable. Even hidden chambers needed to function, at least minimally. Your foot brushes something uneven, a shallow groove in the stone, maybe where a wooden beam once sat, maybe part of a door mechanism now gone. Many underground rooms relied on simple but effective systems, a slab that slid into place, a trapdoor balanced with counterweights, a wall panel that could be nudged open only if you knew exactly where to press. Nothing flashy, just enough to fool someone who wasn't looking for it. And most people weren't. That's the thing about medieval castles. They were crowded. Servants, soldiers, craftsmen, family members, dozens. Sometimes hundreds of people moving through shared spaces. Hidden chambers worked not because everyone was sworn to secrecy, but because no one thought to question what wasn't visible. If a door wasn't obvious, it might as well not exist. You inhale slowly. The air smells older now. Less smoke. More earth. Somewhere above. A fire crackles, its warmth never reaching you. You feel the truth of underground living immediately. It separates you from comfort as much as it protects you from danger. There's an odd calm here, though, a kind of enforced stillness. In times of siege, when shouting, metal, and fear filled the courtyards, spaces like this offered a pause. Not safety. Exactly. More like postponement. One fringe theory suggests that some hidden chambers weren't meant to be used often at all, that they functioned as psychological reassurance for lords who feared betrayal. Knowing there was a place to vanish into, even if you never used it, might have been comfort enough. It's difficult to prove. But standing here, feeling the stone press in on you, it doesn't sound entirely unreasonable. You shift your weight, and a faint echo responds. The chamber is small, intimate. You're aware of your body in it, the brush of your sleeve against stone, the cool air against your face. Medieval architects rarely bothered to make these spaces comfortable because they weren't meant for long stays. Hours, maybe days, not lives. Still, people did stay, sometimes longer than intended. There's a tension in this place between planning and improvisation, between foresight and fear. You sense it in the uneven floor, the slightly mismatched stones, the way the chamber feels more practical than elegant. This wasn't a monk's crypt or a noble's tomb. It was infrastructure for uncertainty. You let your hand trail along the wall again, grounding yourself. Above, the castle presents power, order, permanence. Below, it admits vulnerability. That walls can fall, that fires spread, that enemies get in, and that sometimes the safest place is the one no one remembers to look. You stand there for a moment longer, breathing slowly, letting the quiet settle around you. The stone has absorbed centuries of fear, patience, and waiting. It doesn't release them easily. But if you listen closely, really closely, you can almost feel the intention behind it all. Not drama, not heroics, just survival. You remain below the castle floor, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness. And slowly you begin to understand something important. These underground chambers were not built out of fascination with secrecy. They were built because the world above was unreliable. You picture daily life in a medieval castle. Not the storybook version with banners fluttering and feasts stretching into the night, but the ordinary rhythm. Fires burned constantly. Candles tipped. Smoke crept into beams and thatch. One careless moment could turn an entire complex into flame. It is a well-established historical reality that fire was one of the greatest threats to any medieval structure, even those made largely of stone. Wood was everywhere. Floors, roofs, doors, furniture. Above ground, danger never slept. So you understand why digging down made sense. Below the surface, fire loses its teeth. Flames starve without air. Smoke thins. Heat disperses into earth instead of racing along ceilings. When castles added underground chambers, they were not just adding space. They were adding distance from catastrophe. You take a slow step, feeling how the ground remains firm beneath you. Earth does not panic. Stone does not run. That reliability mattered more than comfort. Another reason presses in quietly. Siege. When a castle was surrounded, life above ground changed immediately. Wells could be poisoned. Courtyards became targets. Towers that once symbolized strength turned into aiming points. Medieval defenders understood that survival often depended on patience rather than force. Hidden underground spaces allowed food, water, documents, or people to be removed from the obvious paths of destruction. Historians still argue whether most hidden chambers were designed primarily for siege scenarios, or whether they evolved from earlier storage spaces that simply became more secretive over time. The distinction matters less when you are standing here, feeling how far removed this place is from the noise of conflict. You imagine the sounds of a siege filtering down, dull thuds instead of sharp crashes, voices reduced to vibrations, fear arriving as pressure rather than sound. Underground chambers transformed chaos into something distant, manageable. But survival was not the only motivation. There is something more personal at work here. Medieval castles were not just military installations. They were homes, political centers, family spaces layered with tension. Power changed hands suddenly. Alliances broke overnight. A lord might fear invaders from outside, but he might fear rivals inside the walls even more. This is where hidden chambers take on a quieter meaning. You think about documents, charters, letters, ledgers, proof of land ownership or betrayal. Losing those could be as devastating as losing soldiers. Underground rooms offered a place to protect information in a world where paper burned easily and memory was fragile. A lesser-known detail found in some castle inventories hints that valuables were sometimes stored in spaces deliberately omitted from official records. Gold was useful, but secrecy was priceless. A chamber that no one admitted existed could not easily be demanded, taxed, or stolen. You pause and listen again. Still nothing. This silence was intentional. Underground rooms were not places of activity. They were places of waiting. You feel that now. Standing still, your body slowly sinking with the quiet. There is a common modern assumption that medieval people lived only day to day, without long-term planning. Yet the very existence of hidden chambers contradicts that idea. Digging underground took time, labor, and trust. It required imagining futures that had not yet arrived. Fire, siege, betrayal, collapse. Some scholars suggest that building down was a way of managing anxiety in an unpredictable world. You cannot control armies or weather, but you can carve stone. You can make a place where danger feels slightly less absolute. A fringe interpretation even proposes that certain chambers were symbolic, not meant to be used, but meant to exist as reassurance, like a locked door you hope never to open. It is difficult to prove, but emotionally it makes sense. Standing here, you feel how the mere presence of this space offers a strange comfort. Even centuries later, you move forward slowly, aware that every step takes you farther from light and closer to intention. The castle above may display authority, but this space reveals its fear. Not panic, just awareness. Awareness that walls fail, that power shifts, that nothing above ground lasts forever. Below ground, medieval builders tried to buy time. Not victory, not safety. You let that thought settle as the air grows cooler around you. Steady and patient, as if the earth itself is willing to wait with you. You move deeper, and the ground itself begins to teach you why some castles hid chambers, while others never could. The stone beneath your feet changes texture. Subtly at first. Then, unmistakably, smooth limestone gives way to rougher surfaces. The walls feel less cooperative here, less willing to be shaped. Medieval builders did not choose underground construction freely. The land decided first. In regions where castles rose from chalk, limestone, or compacted clay, digging downward was possible, even practical. Archaeological surveys show that many hidden chambers cluster in these softer geological zones, where stone could be cut with patience rather than brute force, but where granite ruled, or where groundwater pressed close to the surface. Secrecy below ground became a gamble few were willing to take. You imagine standing where a castle might have been planned, long before the first stone wall ever rose. A master builder presses his boot into the soil, lifts a handful of earth, rubs it between his fingers. This simple gesture carried enormous weight. The future of hidden rooms, escape tunnels, and silent refuges depended on what that soil revealed. You feel the ceiling here. It lowers slightly, uneven in a way that speaks of resistance. Rock does not surrender evenly. Some sections yield, others fight back. Medieval diggers learned quickly where they could push forward and where the earth would punish ambition with collapse. There are signs of that learning all around you. The chamber walls are thicker here. The ceiling arches subtly, distributing weight. These are not decorative choices. They are survival decisions. Builders knew that a hidden chamber was useless if it buried its occupants. Written records hint that collapses were not uncommon in early underground attempts. In some cases, entire projects were abandoned mid-excavation. A strange detail emerges in a few castle sites where half-finished chambers exist. Their floors never leveled. Their walls left raw. They suggest moments when caution finally outweighed fear. You pause, imagining the sound of stone cracking above workers' heads. The sudden silence, the decision to stop. Not every castle could afford that lesson. Water complicates everything. As you walk, the air grows faintly wetter, carrying a cool mineral scent. Medieval builders understood water instinctively, if not scientifically. They noticed where moss thrived, where soil stayed dark even in dry seasons. Digging below the water table meant constant flooding, rot, and sickness. In those places, secrecy had to find other forms. This explains why some castles relied on false walls, hidden staircases, or disguised closets instead of true underground chambers. The absence of hidden rooms does not mean a lack of fear or foresight. Sometimes it simply reflects an uncooperative landscape. There remains disagreement about how deeply medieval builders understood geology as a discipline. Some argue their knowledge was entirely experiential, learned through failure and repetition. Others point to remarkably consistent techniques across regions, suggesting a shared understanding passed between guilds. The truth likely sits somewhere between instinct and tradition, shaped by generations of trial. You run your fingers along a section of wall where the stone changes color. Darker, denser. This seam tells a story. At some point, digging became harder, slower, more dangerous. Decisions had to be made: continue and risk collapse, or stop and reshape the plan. In many castles, hidden chambers were shallow for this very reason. Not deep enough to vanish entirely, but deep enough to be overlooked. Secrecy did not always require depth. Sometimes it required restraint. You notice how the floor slopes gently upward now. This is deliberate. It keeps moisture from pooling. Water was an enemy underground. Not just structurally, but biologically. Damp spaces bred illness, mold, and foul air. Medieval builders might not have named these threats, but they recognized their effects. There is a curious pattern found in some surviving chambers. The most carefully constructed ones often sit slightly off-center from the castle above, not directly beneath the great hall or tower, but tucked under less important spaces. This reduced load, lowered collapse risk, and avoided attention during repairs or renovations. That choice also reflects something psychological. Hidden chambers worked best when they were not directly associated with power. A lord might expect secrets beneath his throne room. He was less likely to suspect them under a pantry or storeroom. You take another step, feeling the steady firmness beneath you. This chamber has survived centuries because someone respected the limits of the land. That restraint is easy to miss when imagining medieval ambition, but it is everywhere once you start looking. There is an odd, quiet confidence in this space. Not arrogance, But acceptance. Builders did not conquer the earth here. They negotiated with it. Some later historians wrestle with whether underground chambers were signs of advanced planning or of insecurity. Standing here, that debate feels incomplete. Planning and insecurity are not opposites. In a medieval world shaped by fire, siege, and betrayal, they often walk together. You sense that now, in the way the stone curves gently overhead, in the thickness of the walls, in the careful compromise between concealment and stability. This place exists because someone understood when to stop digging. You breathe in slowly, aware of how the air remains calm, unmoving. The earth above presses down, but it does so evenly, patiently. It has learned this space, just as the builders once did. And as you continue forward, you realize that secrecy underground was never just about hiding from enemies. It was about understanding limits, of land, of stone, of human control. The castle above may boast strength, but down here, survival depended on humility. You slow your steps as the passage narrows, and you become aware of how careful every movement must have been when this place was first made. Digging underground in a medieval castle was not loud work by accident. It had to be restrained, deliberate, almost polite. You imagine the tools first: iron picks, chisels, wooden wedges, mallets worn smooth by hands that understood rhythm. There were no explosions, no dramatic breakthroughs. Progress happened inch by inch. Stone was persuaded, not forced. Records from several castle sites suggest that excavation often took place at night or during periods of routine noise above, when hammering would blend into daily life. Silence was not always possible, but discretion always mattered. You pause and listen again. Even now, sound behaves strangely here. A shuffle echoes too long. A breath seems amplified. Medieval diggers learned this quickly. Underground, noise does not escape upward easily, but it does linger. A careless strike could carry along stone and give away activity to anyone who knew how to listen. So the work slowed. You picture workers pausing often, tools held mid-air, waiting for echoes to fade, waiting for the castle above to creak, cough, or stir, giving cover to the next careful blow. This was not brute labor. It was patience practiced under pressure. The detail that still surprises modern researchers is how spoil was handled. Earth and broken stone could not simply be piled nearby. That would raise questions. In some documented cases, soil was mixed into existing embankments or gardens. In others, it was carried out in small amounts and scattered far from the site. The effort to hide evidence often exceeded the effort to dig itself. You brush your fingers along a wall where tool marks remain faintly visible. They are shallow, repetitive, almost gentle. These marks tell you that speed was never the goal. Control was. Lighting mattered too. Torches smoked heavily and consumed oxygen quickly. In confined spaces, that could turn dangerous fast. Many underground works relied on oil lamps or small, shielded flames that produced steadier light with less smoke. Even then, air had to be monitored constantly. Workers learned to recognize the signs of bad air long before they understood why it happened. Dizziness, headaches, the instinct to flee. There is a quiet intelligence in that awareness. You notice small niches cut into the walls. At first glance, they seem decorative, but they are practical. Places to set lamps, spots to rest tools, moments of organization in a space where disorder could mean death. There is no agreement among historians on how much of this knowledge was shared formally through guilds and how much was learned through local tradition. What is clear is that similar techniques appear across regions that never communicated directly. Experience traveled faster than messages. You imagine the tension of working here knowing that discovery could bring consequences. Not dramatic punishment, perhaps, but suspicion, questions, loss of trust. In a medieval castle, trust was currency. Some builders were likely sworn to silence. Others may not have known the purpose of what they were digging. just a wall extension, a storage space, a drainage project. Secrecy worked best when information was fragmented. A curious pattern appears in a few castle ruins where tunnels seem intentionally awkward. Low ceilings, sharp turns, uneven floors. These features frustrate modern explorers, but they may have served a purpose. A space that is uncomfortable to navigate discourages curiosity. Even those who stumbled upon an entrance might turn back, assuming nothing worthwhile lay ahead. You shift your weight, feeling the floor dip slightly. This unevenness was not always corrected. Precision mattered only where it supported function. Perfection would have required more time, more noise, more risk. There is something almost intimate about this method of construction. It required trust between a few individuals and secrecy from everyone else. In a world where privacy was rare, that made underground work unusual, not heroic, just quietly dangerous. Some later accounts hint that certain workers were paid extra for this kind of labor. Others suggest payment was delayed until completion, ensuring silence through dependence. The truth is difficult to confirm, but the implication is clear. Secrets had value, and value shaped behavior. You imagine the moment when digging stopped, when the final stone was set, when the space became still for the first time. That silence would have felt heavy, satisfying, uneasy. The tools were removed. Lamps extinguished. The entrance concealed. What remained was not just a room, but a pause in the castle's narrative, a place waiting for a future that might never arrive. You stand here now, centuries later, and feel how carefully this space was made to avoid attention. Even in ruin, it resists spectacle. It does not announce itself. It waits. And as you move forward, you begin to understand that hidden chambers were not accidents of architecture. They were acts of restraint, shaped by hands that knew when not to be heard. You continue along the passage, and gradually the space begins to change. The stonework grows neater. The walls straighten. This is no longer a place defined only by digging. This is where concealment becomes intentional design. You stop in front of what looks like an ordinary wall. It meets the floor cleanly. The stones match those around it. Nothing about it draws your attention, and that is precisely why it works. Hidden entrances in medieval castles rarely relied on elaborate tricks. They relied on familiarity. People walked past the same walls every day. Their eyes learned what belonged. Anything that blended in became invisible. Many concealed doors were weighted slabs that slid sideways or dropped inward. Others pivoted on wooden pegs fitted so tightly that seams all but vanished. In some castles, trapdoors were covered with the same worn stone as the surrounding floor, scuffed and aged on purpose so nothing looked new or suspicious. Builders understood human attention long before psychology gave it a name. You imagine someone standing here centuries ago, pressing a specific stone with practiced pressure. Not hard, not fast, just enough. The wall would respond with a quiet shift, opening a path that did not exist moments before. Written descriptions from the period hint that even castle residents were often unaware of these mechanisms. Servants scrubbed floors over entrances they never noticed. Guards leaned against walls that could open behind them. The effectiveness of secrecy depended on routine. There is a peculiar detail found in some surviving doorways. The moving stone often weighs more than seems necessary. This was deliberate. A heavier door settles more convincingly into place. Gravity becomes part of the disguise. When closed, it feels final, permanent. You run your fingers along the surface, searching for seams. Your hand finds nothing. That tells you how carefully this was done. Precision mattered here more than speed ever did during excavation. Builders favored simplicity because complex mechanisms failed. Wood swelled, metal rusted, dirt crept into joints. A hidden door that worked only once was useless. Many relied on balance rather than force. Counterweights concealed within walls, slopes that allowed gravity to assist opening and closing. There is ongoing disagreement about how often these entrances were tested. Some believe they were opened regularly to prevent seizing. Others think they remained untouched for years. opened only in moments of crisis. Both interpretations have merit. The stone does not keep a schedule. You picture the tension of that moment. The decision to open what should remain closed. The hesitation before revealing a secret that could not be hidden again. Some entrances were disguised as fireplaces. Others hid behind hanging tapestries or beneath staircases where shadows did most of the work. In a few castles, doors were carved into walls that already curved, making seams nearly impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. A strange but telling observation appears in a handful of ruins. The most cleverly hidden doors are often found in the least prestigious rooms. Storage spaces, pantries, narrow service corridors. Power rarely hid its secrets where it displayed itself. You take a slow breath. The air here smells drier, cleaner. That suggests movement. Doors that opened occasionally. Spaces that were meant to connect, not merely exist. There is also evidence that some entrances were intentionally awkward to use, requiring a specific sequence of movements. A press here, a lift there, a step back at just the right moment. This reduced the chance of accidental discovery and ensured that only those trained could access what lay beyond. You imagine how this knowledge was passed on. Quietly, in whispers, perhaps only once. A father showing a son, a lord instructing a trusted steward. Knowledge that lived in bodies and memory rather than on paper. Later historians continue to puzzle over why some hidden entrances are far more elaborate than others. One possibility is status. Another is paranoia. Or perhaps the answer is simpler. Some builders were just better at hiding things. You step back and look at the wall again. It has returned to being nothing, just stone, just part of the castle's skeleton. That is the brilliance of it. Hidden chambers did not rely on darkness alone. They relied on expectation, on the human tendency to stop looking once we think we understand a place. And as you move forward, leaving that invisible door behind, you carry the quiet realization that secrecy in medieval castles was less about magic and more about understanding how easily the eye can be fooled. You step through the concealed threshold and feel the air change almost immediately. It is cooler here, steadier, carrying a faint trace of stone dust and old smoke. This is the point where survival becomes practical. A hidden chamber without air or light was not a refuge. It was a trap. You pause and breathe slowly, noticing how the air moves, or rather how it barely moves at all. Medieval builders did not understand oxygen, but they understood suffocation. They learned through experience that people grow weak quickly in sealed spaces. So they carved solutions quietly into the structure of the castle itself. Somewhere above you, a narrow shaft runs upward. It is not wide enough to crawl through, not wide enough to invite curiosity, just wide enough to let the chamber breathe. These ventilation channels were often disguised as natural cracks or worked into existing architectural features like wall joints or drainage paths. From the outside, they looked accidental. From the inside, they were life. You imagine a thin line of daylight appearing on the wall at certain hours of the day, never enough to illuminate the space fully, just enough to remind the occupants that the world above still existed. That light would shift slowly, marking time in a place where clocks meant nothing. Evidence from surviving chambers suggests that light was treated cautiously. Too much would reveal too much. Openings were angled, bent, or partially blocked to prevent anyone above from seeing movement below. Even when light was allowed in, it arrived indirectly, softened by stone. You move closer to one such opening and feel a faint draft against your skin. It is subtle, but it is there. Medieval builders learned how temperature differences pulled air through spaces naturally. Warm air rising above would draw cooler air upward from below. This quiet circulation required no tools, no maintenance, and no explanation. It simply worked. There is disagreement among researchers about how deliberate these systems were. Some argue they were accidental, discovered through trial and error. Others point to repeated patterns across regions as proof of intentional design. Standing here, feeling how evenly the air flows, it is difficult to believe this was entirely accidental. You think about what it meant to rely on such systems. Fire could not burn freely here. Lamps had to be small. Flames watched carefully. A single mistake could fill the chamber with smoke that had nowhere to go. Some hidden rooms show scorch marks near ceilings, suggesting moments when air turned dangerous quickly. A curious detail emerges in a few sites, where small stone shelves sit directly beneath ventilation shafts. These may have held burning embers rather than open flames, allowing light without consuming too much air. It is a small adaptation, but it speaks to a careful balancing act between visibility and survival. You close your eyes briefly and imagine waiting here, hours passing, maybe days, listening for sounds above, footsteps, voices, the scrape of metal. Light would become precious. Every flicker would be watched closely. Rationed like food, hidden chambers were not meant to feel alive. They were meant to feel suspended. You open your eyes again and notice how the walls curve slightly inward near the ceiling. This shape helps guide smoke and warm air toward exits. It also strengthens the structure. Practical design often wears the disguise of simplicity. Some later commentators wondered whether medieval people feared the dark more than modern audiences assume. The careful management of light here suggests something else. Darkness was not feared. It was controlled, used, shaped. You run your hand along the wall again and feel soot embedded in the stone. Generations of small fires left their mark. These were not ceremonial spaces. They were lived in, briefly and reluctantly. There is an odd calm that settles over you as you stand here. The outside world feels distant. Time slows. This was one of the unintended effects of underground chambers. They insulated not only against danger, but against urgency. Some chroniclers mention nobles who descended into hidden rooms during unrest and emerged disoriented by how long they had been below. Without sun or sound, time became unreliable. This disconnection could be soothing or terrifying, depending on the person. You imagine a child here, told to stay quiet, a mother counting breaths, a guard listening for signals from above. Light would become a language. A raised lamp might mean safety. Darkness might mean waiting. There is also evidence that some chambers were equipped with reflective surfaces, pale stone or polished metal, placed deliberately to spread limited light further. These small choices reveal an understanding of space that feels surprisingly modern. You step back and look around once more. The chamber does not glow. It does not comfort. It simply allows you to exist. That was enough. In a world where survival often depended on visibility and display, these underground spaces inverted the rules. They rewarded stillness, quiet, patience. Light was no longer something to chase. It was something to manage carefully. You take a slow breath, feeling the steady air fill your lungs, and realize that down here, life continued not because of strength, but because of restraint. You leave the chamber slowly, following a passage that bends rather than stretches straight. This curve is not decorative. It is cautious. Straight lines invite speed. Curves invite attention. As you walk, you begin to sense something subtle but important. This underground space does not feel random. It feels organized, almost mirrored. The deeper you go, the more you realize that what exists below echoes what exists above. Medieval castles were not chaotic piles of stone. They followed patterns. Courtyards aligned with halls. Towers balanced walls. And beneath all of that, in some castles, a second structure quietly followed the first. Narrow tunnels paralleled corridors. Small chambers sat beneath rooms of importance. This was not coincidence. It was planning done in whispers. You imagine standing in the great hall above. Long tables, firelight, voices rising and falling. Beneath your feet, this passage runs almost directly under that space, though offset just enough to avoid heavy loads. The castle had a spine, and this was its shadow. Evidence from excavation reports shows that some underground passages align closely with staircases and service routes above ground. This alignment allowed trusted individuals to move unseen between critical points. Not quickly, not comfortably, but discreetly, You slow your pace, feeling the walls narrow slightly. This was never meant for crowds, only a few bodies at a time. Control mattered more than convenience. Some historians point out that castles which developed complex underground routes often did so gradually. A storage cellar extended here. A drainage channel widened there. Over time, these practical spaces connected, forming a quiet network beneath the visible structure. What began as utility slowly became strategy. You run your hand along the wall and feel where stone changes shape. Rough patches where older work meets newer cuts. This is not a single plan executed at once. It is a conversation across generations, each addition responding to new fears, new needs. There is a strange intimacy to that idea. Builders who never met still cooperated. One left space, another filled it. One avoided a load-bearing wall. Another followed that decision centuries later. You imagine how knowledge of these passages was shared, not with maps, not with diagrams, with memory, with guided walks, a steward leading a successor through the dark, saying little, letting the body remember the turns. Maps existed, of course, but rarely for spaces like this. Underground routes thrived on absence from paper, a path that could not be drawn, could not be stolen. A curious observation emerges from several sites where underground passages stop abruptly beneath certain rooms. No continuation, no explanation. These dead ends puzzle modern researchers. Were they abandoned plans, or deliberate traps, or simply places where fear outpaced ambition? You stop at one such junction. The passage ends in a blank wall. Stone meets stone with finality. You feel a faint disappointment, followed by relief. Not every path should continue. Some later accounts suggest that these underground networks were less about escape and more about control of movement. They allowed castle lords to appear unexpectedly, to vanish quietly, to observe without being seen. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it listened from below. You imagine footsteps above you now, their rhythm softened by earth and stone. The sound arrives as vibration rather than noise. Underground. You do not hear events. You sense them. This shadow architecture had limits. It could not support armies. It could not replace walls. But it offered options. And options were everything. There is debate about how often these passages were actually used. Some show clear signs of wear. Smoothed floors. Polished edges where hands brushed stone repeatedly. Others appear almost untouched, as if built for futures that never arrived. You stand between those possibilities now. A passage worn by necessity, another preserved by luck. You notice how the ceiling height shifts subtly as you move. Lower in places where secrecy mattered most. Higher where storage or brief gatherings might occur. These changes guided behavior without instructions. You walked slower where danger was greatest. You stood taller where waiting was expected. It is easy to imagine panic underground, but these spaces were designed to manage fear, not amplify it. Clear paths, predictable turns, familiar textures. All of it worked together to keep people calm when the world above was anything but. Some castle ruins reveal ventilation shafts placed at intersections of underground routes. This suggests these junctions were intentional meeting points, places to pause, to listen, to decide. You pause now, letting your breathing slow. The passage feels less like a tunnel and more like a vein, carrying movement quietly, sustaining the body of the castle without drawing attention. As you move on, you realize something important. These underground networks were not mistakes or afterthoughts. They were parallel systems, less visible, less celebrated, but just as carefully considered. Above ground, castles projected strength. Below ground, they practiced survival. And in that contrast, you begin to understand the full shape of medieval power, not just what stood tall, but what stayed hidden, steady, and ready to endure. You slow as the passage opens into a wider room. And something about this space feels different immediately. It is not empty, but it is not crowded either. The walls are thicker, the floor more level. This is not a place meant for movement. It is a place meant for keeping. You let your eyes adjust and begin to notice small details. Shallow alcoves cut into the stone. Low platforms built directly from the floor. Narrow ledges positioned just above reach. None of these features exist by accident. This chamber was designed to hold things that mattered. Medieval castles needed storage everywhere. But hidden underground chambers served a different purpose than granaries or wine cellars. Grain had to be accessed regularly. Wine had to be rotated. Those spaces were busy. This one is quiet. That tells you something about what it protected. You imagine parchment rolled tightly and sealed with wax, legal documents, land agreements, oaths written down because memory alone was not trusted. Paper was fragile. Fire could erase it in moments. Water could blur it into nothing. Down here, away from both threats, words stood a better chance of surviving than people often did. There is physical evidence in some castle ruins that supports this use. Small iron hooks set into walls. Stone shelves smoothed by careful placement. These features appear in chambers too dry and too controlled to be simple storage. They suggest organization, intention. You step closer to one alcove and picture a chest resting there. Wood bound with iron. Not decorative, just strong. Inside, coins maybe, or jewels, or something more dangerous. Letters that could ruin alliances. Proof that someone lied. In a medieval world, information could be as lethal as a blade. It is tempting to imagine underground chambers as places of dramatic escape, secret tunnels, last-minute flights. But many were far more static than that. They were anchors. Places where a castle's most sensitive materials waited quietly through chaos above. There is an odd detail noted in a few excavation reports. Some hidden chambers contain objects that show no signs of hurried placement. Items arranged neatly, containers sealed carefully. This suggests preparation rather than panic. These spaces were stocked deliberately, long before they were needed. That foresight changes how you read this room. It is not desperate, it is cautious. You run your hand along the stone and feel how dry it remains. Builders paid attention to moisture here. Drainage channels lead away from the chamber subtly. The floor slopes just enough to guide water out. Dampness would have ruined everything stored inside. Some researchers have noted traces of lime wash on the walls of certain underground rooms. This coating helped repel moisture and lightened the space slightly. It also discouraged insects. A simple treatment with multiple benefits. You imagine a steward descending into this chamber once a year. Perhaps less. Checking seals, counting items, making sure nothing shifted. The act itself would have been ritualistic, quiet, almost sacred. There is debate among historians about how access to such spaces was controlled. Some believe only the Lord knew. Others suggest a small circle of trusted officials shared responsibility. Absolute secrecy was risky. If one person died, knowledge could vanish with them. Balance mattered. You step back and take in the room as a whole. It does not feel like a hiding place for people. It feels like a hiding place for continuity, for the things that allowed power to persist beyond a single crisis. A curious fringe observation comes from castles, where similar chambers exist but contain nothing of value. No hooks, no shelves, just empty space. This has led some to wonder whether certain rooms were decoys, built to be found, to distract, to satisfy intruders searching for hidden wealth. The idea is unsettling, but not implausible. Medieval defense often relied on misdirection. A discovered chamber that contained nothing might convince attackers there were no deeper secrets. You imagine the disappointment of someone forcing their way inside only to find bare stone. The relief of those above knowing the real treasures lay elsewhere. You breathe slowly, feeling how the air remained still here. This chamber was not meant for frequent use. Every opening of the door would have been intentional, measured, controlled. There is also the matter of noise. Chests opening, metal clinking, even careful movements echo underground. This space would have demanded restraint. The quieter the chamber, the safer its contents remained. You think about the psychology of storing valuable items in places you rarely see. Out of sight, but not out of mind. It requires trust, not in people, but in stone. Some later historians struggle with the idea that medieval castles invested so much effort in protecting objects rather than lives. But that distinction is misleading. Documents preserved claims. Claims preserved land. Land preserved families. Objects carried futures. You turn slowly, imagining the chamber filled not with gold, but with patience, with preparation, with an understanding that survival was not always about the next battle, but about the next generation. As you leave the room, the passage narrows again, and you feel the weight of what you are leaving behind. Not treasure in the romantic sense, but stability. The quiet machinery of power that worked best when no one noticed it. And as your steps carry you forward, you begin to see underground chambers not as places of fear, but as places where medieval castles held their breath and waited. You move onward, and the air shifts again, carrying a faint scent of ash that seems to have soaked into the stone long ago. This passage feels closer to danger, as if the walls themselves remember heat and impact. Underground chambers did not exist in isolation. They were shaped by the threats that haunted the castle above, especially siege and fire. You picture a castle under attack, not the dramatic charge of soldiers at dawn, but the slow grind of waiting. Days stretch into weeks. Food tightens. Tempers fray. Outside the walls, enemies test patience more than strength. Inside, every decision becomes heavier. Fire was always the fastest way to end a siege. Flames ignored stone walls by devouring what those walls sheltered. Roofs collapsed. Beams fell. Smoke rolled through corridors faster than people could flee. Contemporary accounts describe castles that withstood months of assault, only to fall in a single night because fire found a way in. That is why these underground spaces feel so deliberate. Below ground, fire behaves differently. It loses its hunger. Without steady air, it weakens quickly. Smoke rises, searching for escape, leaving lower spaces clearer than anything above. Medieval defenders noticed this long before they could explain it. Experience taught them where survival lasted longest. You imagine retreating downward as smoke thickens overhead. Each step brings cooler air. Sounds dull. Panic fades into urgency. Underground chambers offered something rare in crisis. A pause. There is physical evidence that supports this use. Some hidden rooms show scorch marks only near entrances, not deeper inside. This suggests people retreated quickly, sealing doors behind them to cut off airflow. Fire died above, while life continued below. You stop and place your palm against the wall. The stone feels smooth here, as if it has been touched often. Perhaps in moments of fear, perhaps in moments of relief. Siege warfare also shaped these spaces. When attackers breached outer defenses, inner sanctuaries mattered. Hidden chambers allowed defenders to disappear from expected routes. A staircase that should have led to living quarters ended in nothing. A corridor that should have been crowded stood empty. This absence could be as powerful as any weapon. Some castles included underground refuges designed specifically for short-term survival. They held water stored in ceramic vessels, bread hardened for longevity, sometimes dried meat. These were not comfortable provisions. They were practical ones, enough to wait out a fire, enough to survive a day or two of chaos. There is debate among historians about whether these refuges were meant for nobles only, or for broader groups. Some chambers are too small to hold many people. Others are larger, with signs of multiple occupants. The variation suggests there was no single rule. Each castle balanced protection according to its own fears. You imagine the sound of siege engines striking stone above you, each impact sending vibrations through the earth, underground. These shocks would feel distant, muffled, still terrifying, but less immediate. A strange detail appears in some underground chambers that seems connected to this purpose. Doorways are often narrow and angled. This made them easier to block. A single beam, a stone slab. Once sealed, They became difficult to force open from either side. This raises an unsettling question. Were these spaces ever used to trap, rather than protect? Some later commentators suggest that in moments of extreme danger, underground chambers might have been sealed intentionally, leaving occupants to wait without knowing if anyone would return. It is impossible to confirm. The stone keeps its silence. But the possibility lingers. You take a slow breath, aware of how enclosed the passage feels now. Underground safety came with emotional costs. Darkness, stillness, uncertainty. Fire did not just threaten bodies. It threatened records, wealth, lineage. By protecting documents underground, castles protected claims to land and authority. A lord who survived a siege but lost proof of ownership might lose everything afterward. You imagine emerging from such a chamber after days below, the castle blackened, the air sharp with smoke, but the documents safe, the future intact. There is something deeply human in that calculation. A curious fringe detail surfaces in some accounts of siege aftermaths. In a few cases, attackers discovered hidden chambers only after the castle was abandoned, long after they had stopped looking for survivors. These spaces escaped notice because they did not smell of fire or death. They were sealed too well. That effectiveness cuts both ways. You step forward and feel the passage widen slightly, as if acknowledging the importance of what it once protected. Underground chambers designed for fire and siege were not meant to be permanent homes. They were lifeboats. Uncomfortable, claustrophobic, essential. There is still disagreement about how often they saved lives. Records are incomplete. Stories conflict. Some accounts praise their role, others ignore them entirely. Survival rarely leaves neat documentation. What remains undeniable is that these spaces reflect a worldview shaped by expectation of disaster. Medieval castles did not assume peace. They prepared for interruption. You pause and listen once more. No fire, no siege, only your own breathing. Standing here now, you understand that underground chambers were answers to very specific questions. What happens when walls fail? When fire wins? When the obvious paths become death traps? Below ground, castles kept one last option open. Not escape, not victory. Endurance. You hesitate before stepping farther, because the feeling here is different again. The passage narrows, then opens into a space that does not invite movement or storage. It invites stillness. The air feels heavier, not with damp, but with intention. This chamber sits apart from the others. You sense it immediately. The walls are closer, the ceiling lower, the stone darker, either by age or by choice. This is not a place designed for comfort or efficiency. It is a place designed to contain people. You let that thought settle slowly. Underground chambers in medieval castles were not always benevolent refuges. Some served purposes that are harder to romanticize. Confinement was one of them. Castles needed places to hold individuals temporarily, quietly, and out of sight. Not every prisoner was meant to be displayed in a tower or paraded through a courtyard. You imagine a person being led down here. No chains clanking dramatically, just footsteps, a torch held low, a door that closes with a sound that feels heavier than it should. Records from several regions indicate that castles often held short-term detainees below ground rather than invisible cells. These might be political hostages, disobedient servants, rival claimants, or messengers who arrived at the wrong moment. Underground confinement reduced attention and reduced risk. You notice how the floor here is smoother near the center, worn not by traffic but by pacing. Small movements, repeated steps. Waiting. There is no furniture, no bench, no table. That absence is deliberate. Comfort was not the goal. Compliance was. You look at the walls more closely and notice faint scratch marks. Not deep enough to be dramatic, just enough to suggest time passing slowly. Someone marking days, or simply pressing fingers into stone out of frustration. It is tempting to imagine dungeons as medieval castles are often portrayed. dark pits of cruelty, but many underground holding spaces were more restrained than legend suggests. They were not designed to kill. They were designed to remove someone from circulation. Silence was a tool here. You imagine how disorienting this would feel. No sense of time. No sense of activity above. Even the sound of life is muted. The world shrinks to stone and breath. Some historical accounts suggest that such chambers were used briefly, sometimes only overnight. A cooling-off space, a place to isolate a problem until a decision could be made. Others imply longer stays, especially during political upheaval. The truth is uneven. Evidence varies from site to site. Some chambers show signs of prolonged use. Others appear almost untouched, as if built for a possibility that rarely materialized. You stand still and listen. The quiet here is not peaceful. It is controlled. A curious observation emerges in some castle ruins, where these chambers include small openings near the ceiling that do not align with ventilation systems. They may have been designed to allow sound to travel in, but not out. Voices above drifting faintly down. Reminders of life continuing without you. That detail changes how you feel in this space. It is not complete isolation. It is selective connection. You imagine being held here during a siege, uncertain whether danger or negotiation will decide your fate. Underground chambers like this could serve both as refuge and as containment. The line between protection and imprisonment blurred easily in moments of crisis. This ambiguity is difficult for modern observers. We like clear categories: safe or dangerous, refuge or prison. Medieval architecture rarely respected such simplicity. You think about who decided how these spaces were used. A lord, a steward, a commander under pressure. Decisions made quickly, guided by fear as much as strategy. Some later writers wrestle with whether underground chambers were more often used to protect loyal people or to neutralize threats. The evidence refuses to lean clearly in either direction. Both uses appear again and again, sometimes within the same castle. You take a slow breath, feeling the air settle in your lungs. It is breathable. That matters. This space was not meant to execute quietly. It was meant to hold. There is a strange restraint in that. You imagine the door opening after hours or days, light flooding in briefly, a decision reached. Release, transfer, or something worse. The chamber itself remains unchanged, indifferent to outcomes. You step back toward the passage, and the feeling eases slightly. Movement returns. Options return. This chamber does not follow you. It stays behind, doing what it was built to do. As you leave, you realize something uncomfortable. Underground chambers were tools. Like any tool, they reflected the intentions of those who used them. Protection and cruelty often shared the same walls. And as your footsteps carry you forward, you understand that secrecy below ground did not guarantee safety or mercy. It guaranteed control. In medieval castles, control was often the difference between survival and disappearance. You move on with a quieter step now, as if the stone itself has asked for restraint. The passage angles downward again, and the air grows slightly drier. This part of the underground feels purposeful in a different way, less communal, more selective. You begin to sense the logic of escape. Medieval castles were built with confidence, but also with suspicion. Loyalty was expected, yet betrayal was always possible. A lord trusted his walls, but he trusted people far less. That understanding shaped what came next. Some underground chambers were connected to routes that did not loop back into the castle at all. They led outward. Slowly, indirectly, away from noise and attention. These were not heroic tunnels meant for dramatic flight under moonlight. They were quiet exits, designed to remove a single person from danger without spectacle. You imagine the planning involved, choosing a direction that avoided wells, roads, and obvious landmarks, digging long enough to reach safety, but not so far that collapse became likely. Every meter added risk. Evidence from surviving tunnel systems suggests these routes were narrow and deliberately uncomfortable. Low ceilings forced you to stoop, Uneven floors slowed movement. This was not oversight. Speed was not the goal. Control was. An escape route that encouraged haste invited mistakes. A slow route encouraged caution. You picture a noble descending alone or with one trusted companion. No entourage. No guards clanking behind. Just a lantern shielded carefully. Its light kept low. The tunnel absorbs sound. The castle above continues its routines, unaware that power is slipping quietly away. There are written hints in medieval chronicles of rulers who vanished during unrest and reappeared weeks later, far from their original strongholds. The accounts rarely describe how they escaped. That absence speaks volumes. You pause where the passage bends sharply. This turn hides what lies ahead and what lies behind. A defensive choice. If someone followed, they would not see you until it was too late. Some scholars suggest that many supposed escape tunnels were never used. Built in fear, maintained in hope, forgotten in peace. That idea feels plausible. Building a way out does not mean you will ever need to take it. Still, the tunnels existed. You run your hand along the wall and feel where the stone is smoother. This route has been used. Not often, but enough to leave memory in the surface. There is an odd pattern found in a few castle sites where escape routes pass close to other underground chambers without connecting to them. Walls separate them by only a few feet. This suggests a hierarchy of secrecy. Not all secrets were meant to overlap. You imagine how knowledge of these routes was guarded. Perhaps only the lord and one trusted advisor knew the full path. Others might know only fragments. Enough to help, not enough to betray. This compartmentalization of knowledge mirrors the architecture itself. Nothing here is simple. Nothing is shared freely. The passage grows tighter, then widens again. You sense fresh air. Not open air, but something closer to it. The earth thins. The stone changes texture. You are approaching the edge of the castle's influence. Escape routes often emerged in unremarkable places. A copse of trees. A ditch. A hollow that looked like nothing at all. Safety depended on anonymity. A curious detail appears in some exit points where stones were arranged to fall inward after passage, disguising the opening. Once used, the tunnel could erase itself. One escape. One chance. That design choice carries weight. It implies expectation of finality. If you use this path, you may not return. You imagine standing at the threshold, hearing distant conflict above, choosing whether to stay or go, duty pulling one way, survival the other. Some later historians argue that escape tunnels undermine the image of medieval honor, that a true leader would stand and fight. But that is a modern reading. Medieval power was pragmatic. A living lord could reclaim land. A dead one could not. You feel that pragmatism in this space. No decoration. No ceremony. Just function. There is also evidence that some escape routes doubled as supply paths during construction. Materials moved in. Debris moved out. Once the castle was complete, their purpose narrowed. What was useful became secret. You reach a point where the passage slopes upward more sharply. Your breathing changes. Your body prepares for transition. Underground no longer feels infinite. It feels temporary. You stop before the final bend and look back. Darkness swallows the tunnel quickly. This place does not invite reflection. It demands decision. You imagine the relief of stepping into open air after hours below. The shock of wind. The smell of earth and leaves. The sudden return of space. Escape routes were not symbols of cowardice. They were acknowledgments of reality. Walls fall. Alliances break. Survival sometimes requires absence. As you turn forward again and continue on, you realize that underground chambers did not just hide people. They preserved options. In a world where power shifted unpredictably, options mattered more than ideals. And somewhere deep beneath the castle, this narrow path waited patiently, asking only one question when the time came. Stay, or disappear. You step away from the narrowing escape route and into a space that feels unexpectedly calm. The stone here is smoother, lighter in color, and the air carries a faint dryness that suggests careful planning. This chamber does not feel defensive. It feels intentional in a quieter, more deliberate way. This is a place shaped by belief. In medieval castles, faith was not confined to chapels above ground. Religion threaded through every layer of life, including the hidden ones. Underground chambers were sometimes used to protect objects that carried spiritual weight, especially during times of unrest. When armies moved and loyalties shifted, sacred items needed places that fire and theft could not easily reach. You imagine a small wooden chest resting against the wall. Inside, perhaps a relic wrapped in cloth, a fragment of bone, a sliver of wood said to come from a holy cross. Whether these objects truly held divine power mattered less than the belief that they did. Belief shaped behavior, and behavior shaped architecture. There are accounts of castles sheltering religious treasures during invasions, particularly when nearby monasteries were threatened. Stone rooms below ground offered protection that churches made of timber could not. These chambers became temporary sanctuaries, removed from ritual but not from reverence. You notice shallow carvings along one wall, not decoration, but marks left by repeated contact. Hands touching stone in moments of quiet prayer, knees resting where the floor dips slightly. This space was not meant for ceremony. It was meant for waiting. Some underground rooms show traces of pigment on the walls. Faded reds, soft whites, lime wash mixed with mineral colors. These were not attempts at beauty. They were attempts at calm. Color changes how a space feels, even in near darkness. There is uncertainty about how often these chambers were used for worship rather than storage. Some researchers believe they were primarily vaults. Others suggest moments of prayer happened whenever people waited underground for danger to pass. The truth likely shifts with circumstance. Fear often brings faith closer. You stand still and listen. The silence here feels different from other chambers. Less heavy, less tense. It carries patience rather than control. You imagine a priest descending quietly with a single lamp, checking on a relic hidden away during siege. The act itself would have been reassuring, proof that something sacred remained untouched, even if the world above burned. A curious detail appears in a few castles, where underground chambers contain small stone basins with no clear drainage. These may have held holy water, refreshed periodically, or they may have been symbolic, representing purification rather than use. The stone does not explain itself. You think about how medieval people understood protection. Walls defended bodies. Faith defended meaning. Underground chambers allowed both to persist in silence. There is something deeply human about hiding what you cannot replace. Relics, texts, symbols. These carried continuity across generations. Losing them felt like losing the past and the future at once. You take a slow breath and feel how this chamber invites stillness. Not enforced, chosen. Some later observers struggle to reconcile secret underground spaces with religious devotion, imagining faith as something that demands openness. Medieval practice did not see a contradiction. Sacred things were powerful precisely because they were guarded. You imagine emerging from this chamber after danger passed, carrying a relic back into light, restoring it to a chapel. The underground did not replace faith. It preserved it. You turn slowly, letting the quiet settle. This place does not feel forgotten. It feels reserved. As you leave the chamber, the passage tightens again, and the stone grows darker. The calm fades gradually, replaced by the familiar sense of caution that defines most underground spaces. Yet something lingers. A softness, a reminder that not every hidden chamber existed because of fear alone. Some existed because people wanted to protect what gave them hope. And as your footsteps carry you onward, deeper beneath the castle, you understand that secrecy below ground was not only about survival of bodies and power, it was also about survival of belief. You move forward again, and the passage softens in a way that is difficult to describe at first. The walls do not press in quite as tightly. The air feels less sharp. This space was shaped with bodies in mind, but not armored ones. Smaller, Quieter. You realize who this place was for. When danger rose above ground, underground chambers became places of waiting for those least able to fight or flee. Women, children, the elderly. Those whose survival depended not on strength, but on remaining unnoticed. You imagine being guided here in low light, a hand on your shoulder, a whispered instruction to stay close. No running, no talking. The urgency is real, but it is wrapped in calm. Panic would carry sound too easily. These chambers were not designed for long-term comfort, but they were shaped to reduce fear. Corners are rounded, floors are smoother. The ceiling rises just enough to allow standing without stooping. These details matter when you are asking people to wait in silence for hours or days. Evidence from some castle sites suggests that mats or simple bedding once lay here. Straw, wool blankets. Nothing permanent, just enough to soften stone and muffle movement. Traces are faint, but they repeat often enough to form a pattern. You pause and listen, imagining the sounds that once filled this space. Soft breathing, a child shifting in sleep, a hushed voice offering reassurance. Underground. Every sound feels louder to the person making it, even when it does not travel far. You imagine the discipline required to remain quiet when fear presses in. Children taught early to still themselves. Mothers learning to read danger through vibration rather than sound. Waiting becomes a skill. There is a subtle slope in the floor that leads toward a drainage channel. Practical. Necessary. People waiting underground still needed to drink water, to eat, to manage waste quietly. This was not spoken of openly, but it was accounted for. Some later commentators assume medieval castles did not plan for the comfort of non-combatants. These spaces challenge that idea. They show awareness, not generosity, but responsibility, protecting heirs and families' protected futures. You think about the emotional weight carried here. Adults suppressing fear so children would not absorb it. Time stretching without markers. Light rationed carefully so faces could still be seen when needed. There are no marks of chains or restraints here. That absence matters. This was not containment. It was shelter. You notice shallow depressions along the wall where hands might have rested repeatedly. Perhaps people leaned there. Perhaps they prayed quietly. Stone remembers touch longer than sound. There is disagreement among historians about how often these chambers were used in practice. Some argue they were emergency measures rarely activated. Others suggest periods of unrest made underground waiting a familiar experience for castle families. Written records focus on battles and treaties, not on hours spent in silence below ground. You imagine a child growing up with this memory, the smell of stone, the feel of cool air, the lesson that danger could arrive without warning, and safety sometimes meant disappearing. A curious detail appears in some chambers where small decorative elements exist, not elaborate carvings, but simple shapes scratched into stone. Circles, lines, marks that feel personal rather than official, perhaps made by children, perhaps by adults trying to pass time quietly. These marks humanize the space. They remind you that underground chambers were not abstract defenses. They were lived in, however briefly. You step slowly, careful not to disturb the imagined stillness. Even now, centuries later, the room seems to ask for quiet. Some medieval guides written for noble households mention rehearsals for emergencies, instructions for where family members should go, who should guide them, what to carry. These rehearsals were likely uncomfortable, but they turned fear into routine. Routine kept people calm when it mattered most. You imagine a mother memorizing the path in the dark, counting steps, learning turns by feel rather than sight. This knowledge would be passed down, not written, held in the body. There is a tenderness to that kind of preparation. It acknowledges vulnerability without surrendering to it. You take a slow breath and feel the steadiness of the air. Underground chambers like this did not promise safety. They offered a chance to wait out violence, a chance to keep the most fragile lives intact while decisions were made above. As you move on, the passage narrows again. and the softness recedes. But the memory of this space stays with you, a reminder that medieval castles were not only engines of war and power, they were also places where people tried, quietly and imperfectly, to protect one another. And beneath the stone and strategy, that effort still echoes, faint but persistent, in the cool silence you leave behind. You move onward, and almost without noticing, your awareness shifts from sight to sound, or rather, to the absence of it, underground. Hearing becomes less about noise and more about interpretation. You pause and stand still. The silence here is not empty. It is layered. It carries weight. Above ground, sound travels freely. Voices bounce off walls. Footsteps echo down corridors. Underground, everything changes. Stone absorbs. Earth muffles. What reaches you does so slowly. Softened. Stripped of detail. You do not hear words. You feel presence. Medieval builders understood this intuitively. They learned how sound behaved below the surface by listening, by waiting, by paying attention to what could and could not be heard. This knowledge shaped the placement of chambers and passages as much as stone and soil did. You imagine standing here during a siege. The clash of metal above would not arrive as sharp noise, but as dull vibration, a tremor through the floor, a pulse through the walls. Underground. Danger announces itself differently. You become aware of your own movements. The scrape of a boot feels louder than it should. Your breathing seems intrusive. This is not because sound carries far here, but because there is so little else to compete with it. Silence magnifies awareness. That awareness was a defense. Some underground chambers were placed deliberately far from staircases and main halls to avoid sound leakage. Others were positioned near areas of constant background noise, like kitchens or workshops, where small sounds would blend in. Placement mattered as much as construction. You run your fingers along the wall and notice subtle irregularities, slight protrusions, shallow recesses. These break up sound waves, preventing echoes from traveling cleanly. They are small choices, but they change how a space feels. There is evidence in some castles that underground passages were designed with turns and bends not only for concealment, but for sound control. A straight tunnel carries noise efficiently. A curved one disrupts it. Every corner absorbs a little more sound. You imagine a guard above pacing back and forth. His steps arrive here as a rhythm, not as individual footfalls, a slow pulse. From that pulse, someone waiting underground could judge distance, direction, and even mood. Listening became a skill. People learned to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar vibrations. The steady movement of servants, the heavier tread of armored boots, the irregular shudder of siege engines. Underground, information arrived through the body rather than the ear. You notice how the ceiling here lowers slightly, bringing sound closer. In narrower spaces, even quiet movements feel amplified to the person making them. This encouraged stillness. Underground chambers trained behavior without instruction. Some chambers include shallow niches or stone benches positioned against walls rather than in the center. This reduced sound from shifting weight and allowed people to lean rather than pace. Even rest was shaped by acoustics. There is disagreement among researchers about whether medieval builders consciously understood acoustics as a concept. What is clear is that they understood effects. They noticed what worked. They repeated it. You imagine children being taught to move slowly here, to place feet carefully, to breathe through noses rather than mouths, not because anyone explained sound physics, but because experience demanded it. A curious detail appears in a few underground spaces, where floors are layered with compacted earth rather than bare stone. Earth absorbs sound better. It also softens footfalls. This choice sacrificed durability for quiet. You pause again, letting your breathing slow until it blends with the stillness. This is what waiting sounded like. Almost nothing. Above, a door closes. You feel it rather than hear it. The vibration travels down the stone, arrives faintly, then fades. Underground. Events announce themselves and then disappear quickly. This fleeting quality made listening difficult but also reassuring. Noise that did not persist was less likely to be danger. You think about how fear changes hearing, how the body strains for information. Underground chambers forced people to recalibrate, to trust subtle cues rather than obvious ones. Some accounts from later periods mention people mistaking natural shifts in the earth for approaching enemies. Stone settling, water moving through soil. The underground never stays perfectly still. Learning its rhythms was essential to avoid panic. You imagine a night spent here, eyes closed, counting breaths, listening to the castle sleep, underground. Sleep comes differently, not in full rest, but in drifting awareness, half listening, half dreaming. This space feels like that, not fully awake, not fully asleep. You take one slow step forward and then stop, appreciating how the sound disappears almost immediately. The stone accepts it and lets it go. That was the goal. Underground chambers did not amplify fear. They dampened it. They stripped away excess information until only what mattered remained. As you move on, you carry this awareness with you. Every step measured. Every breath deliberate. You understand now that survival below ground depended as much on listening as on hiding. And in this quiet, shaped carefully by stone and patience, medieval castles learned how to hear danger without inviting it closer. You feel the temperature before you fully notice it. Not a sudden chill, but a steady presence that settles into your skin and refuses to leave. Underground. Cold does not arrive dramatically. It waits. This is the kind of cold medieval builders expected. Constant, predictable, unmoved by seasons or weather above. Stone holds temperature with stubborn loyalty. And down here, it favors coolness. You rub your hands together slowly, imagining how people once coped with this environment. Underground chambers offered protection, but warmth was never part of the promise. In summer, this coolness would have been a relief. In winter, it became another test of endurance. Evidence from excavations shows that underground spaces often stayed several degrees warmer than the open air during harsh winters, yet colder than any room with an active hearth. This balance made them survivable but uncomfortable. People could endure the cold here longer than outside, but not indefinitely. You picture someone wrapped in wool, sitting against a wall, pulling fabric tighter with each passing hour. The stone beneath them draws heat away slowly. Patiently, the body responds by conserving energy. Movement becomes minimal. Speech fades. This was not accidental. Cold encourages stillness. Stillness encourages silence. You notice how the walls here are thicker, how the chamber is smaller than others you have passed. Less air to warm, less surface to steal heat. Medieval builders did not fight the cold. They managed it. Some chambers show signs of small, carefully controlled heat sources. Not open fires, but embers contained in ceramic vessels or metal braziers. These provided minimal warmth without consuming too much air. The goal was not comfort. It was function. There is a curious detail found in several underground rooms where the floor is layered with compacted organic material beneath stone. Straw, ash, even crushed shells in coastal regions. These layers added insulation, reducing the relentless pull of cold from below. You imagine the quiet preparation before someone entered such a space during winter. Extra layers gathered. Cloaks chosen not for appearance but for thickness. Boots lined with felt or fur. The underground demanded planning. Cold also shaped how long people stayed. These chambers were not designed for extended habitation in winter months. They were shelters measured in hours or days, not weeks. The body can endure cold if it knows relief will come. You pause and listen to your own breathing. In cold spaces, breath becomes visible even when light is low. Each exhale confirms you are still warm enough to fog the air. Some medieval accounts describe people using body heat strategically underground, sitting close together, sharing cloaks, leaning shoulder to shoulder. Warmth became communal rather than individual. This closeness carried emotional weight. Privacy disappeared. Fear and comfort mixed freely. Underground chambers forced human contact, even among those who might not have chosen it otherwise. You imagine a family huddled together here during winter unrest. Children tucked between adults. Every movement careful to conserve warmth. Time passing slowly, marked only by the cooling of limbs and the quiet reassurance of shared presence. There is disagreement among historians about how often underground chambers were used during the coldest months. Some believe they were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Others point to evidence of winter use in regions where above-ground survival became impossible during siege or fire. The truth likely varied by circumstance. Cold underground was preferable to burning above. You run your hand along the wall and feel how dry it is. Dry cold is easier to endure than damp. Builders understood this. Drainage mattered as much for warmth as for health. Wet stone steals heat aggressively. Some chambers include wooden linings along sections of wall. These were not structural. They were insulating. Wood interrupts the transfer of cold. Even thin planks. Over time, many rotted away, leaving only nail holes and darker stone as evidence. You notice those holes now. Small, evenly spaced. A reminder that comfort once existed here. Briefly and imperfectly. Cold also preserved. Food stored underground lasted longer. Water stayed clean. Rodents avoided the chill. In some cases, underground chambers doubled as winter storage, their cold extending usefulness rather than limiting it. You think about how medieval people experienced cold differently than modern ones. They expected it, endured it daily. Their clothing, diets, and routines adapted accordingly. Underground cold was not shocking. It was familiar. Still, it demanded respect. You imagine someone falling asleep here despite the chill. Exhaustion overriding discomfort. Sleep underground was light, fragmented. The cold kept the body alert even in rest. This space feels like that. A place that allows survival but resists comfort. You step forward and feel the temperature remain unchanged. Underground does not care about time passing. It holds its climate steadily, patiently, as if reminding you that the earth moves on its own schedule. As you move on, you understand that cold was not a flaw of underground chambers. It was part of their design, a quiet force that encouraged brevity, cooperation, and discipline. In medieval castles, warmth belonged to hearths and halls. Cold belonged to places of waiting. And down here, in this steady chill, people learned how long they could endure when survival asked for stillness rather than fire. You continue onward, and the passage takes on a practical feeling again. Not emotional, not symbolic, just necessary. This is where survival becomes unromantic. Underground. People still had bodies. Bodies needed food. Bodies produced waste. No amount of secrecy or stone could change that. You step into a narrow chamber where the floor dips slightly toward one corner. The air smells faintly different here. Sharper. Carrying a trace of old organic matter that stone never fully forgets. This space was not meant to impress. It was meant to function quietly. Food taken underground had to last. Fresh bread spoiled quickly in enclosed spaces. Meat attracted pests, so what came down here was chosen carefully. Hardened bread, dried legumes, salted meat if available, foods that required little preparation and produced little waste. Evidence from several castle sites suggests that underground refuges often stored food separately from valuables. Smell mattered. Rot mattered. One spoiled item could contaminate an entire chamber. Separation reduced risk. You imagine a small clay jar sealed tightly, opened only when necessary. Each opening would be measured, rations counted silently, hunger managed rather than satisfied. Water was even more critical. Wells were rarely dug this deep due to contamination risk. So water had to be brought in. Ceramic vessels were favored because they kept water cool and did not leach taste. Some underground chambers show shallow niches sized precisely for such containers. You pause and imagine the weight of responsibility carried by whoever controlled these supplies. One mistake could turn refuge into suffering. Waste presented the most uncomfortable challenge. Underground chambers could not rely on convenience. Solutions had to be discreet, contained, and temporary. Simple pits lined with stone, covered containers emptied only when safe, drainage channels angled away from living areas. This part of survival rarely appears in romantic accounts, but it shaped how long people could remain hidden. Cleanliness mattered not for comfort, but for health. Illness underground spread quickly. You notice how the stone here is darker near the floor. Repeated cleaning. Lime used to sanitize surfaces. Medieval people did not understand bacteria, but they understood smell, decay, and consequence. Some underground chambers include small side passages that lead nowhere obvious. These may have served as waste routes, sealed after use. Once again, secrecy relied on removal rather than elimination. You imagine the discipline required to manage all this in silence. No rushing, no frustration allowed. Every action measured against its sound and smell. There is disagreement among historians about how long people could realistically survive underground using these systems. Some argue only hours. Others point to evidence of stays lasting several days. The difference likely depended on preparation and luck. You think about preparation now. Underground chambers rewarded foresight. Those stocked in advance offered choices. Those entered in haste demanded endurance. A curious detail appears in some sites where underground chambers include remnants of herbs stored in small bundles. Mint, rosemary, thyme. These were not food. They were odor control. Hung near waste containers, crushed underfoot to mask smell. Such small adaptations reveal a practical intelligence shaped by necessity rather than theory. You imagine a person sitting quietly, chewing slowly, aware that every bite reduces future options. Hunger sharpens listening. Thirst sharpens patience. Underground survival trained the mind as much as the body. You feel how this chamber does not invite lingering. It feels temporary by design, a place to manage needs and then move on. Some later writers struggled to accept that medieval castles planned for such realities. They preferred to imagine noble suffering as dramatic and brief. In truth, survival often depended on managing discomfort without spectacle. You take a slow breath and feel how the air remains breathable despite everything that once happened here. That is success. The chamber did its job. As you move back into the passage, the scent fades, replaced by cooler stone. The unspoken realities remain behind you, but their importance stays clear. Underground chambers were not just about hiding from danger, they were about sustaining life quietly while danger passed. And in that balance between secrecy and necessity, medieval castles revealed a truth that feels timeless. Survival is rarely elegant. It is careful, measured, and deeply human. You move on, and something subtle changes again. The passage no longer feels like a route meant to be traveled often. It feels uncertain, almost hesitant. The floor is less even. The walls show fewer signs of finishing. This is a place shaped more by memory than by record. Here, you begin to understand how much of the underground existed without ever being written down. Medieval castles were documented carefully above ground. Halls, towers, gates, and lands appeared in inventories and charters. Below ground, things were different. Hidden chambers often lived only in the minds of those who needed them. No drawings, no maps, no official acknowledgement. You pause and imagine how knowledge of this place survived. A steward walking a narrow route with a successor. A whispered instruction given once and never repeated. A count of steps. A turn remembered by the feel of a wall rather than by direction. Maps would have been dangerous here. A stolen document could reveal everything, so the underground relied on human memory. Imperfect but private. You notice how this passage forks briefly, then rejoins. It feels unnecessary, yet it serves a purpose. If someone followed without knowing the route, they might choose wrong. Even a short delay could matter. Some historians suggest that the lack of written plans was not accidental neglect, but deliberate erasure. A chamber not recorded could be denied. A tunnel not mapped could be forgotten if it became a liability. Forgetting was sometimes a form of defense. You imagine a lord deciding not to pass on knowledge of a certain chamber. Perhaps it was unsafe. Perhaps it was compromised. Perhaps it belonged to a threat that no longer existed. Silence closed it more effectively than stone. There are cases where modern excavations uncover underground spaces that do not match any historical descriptions. These are not oversights. They are absences. The underground kept its own archive. You run your hand along the wall and feel a place where stone changes suddenly, where rough work meets smoother surfaces. This might mark a point where digging stopped. Not because the chamber was finished, but because memory ended. Once knowledge was lost, reopening a space became risky. No one remembered what lay beyond. Collapse, bad air, traps. Fear kept doors closed long after danger passed. You imagine a later generation walking above this passage, unaware of what lay beneath. The castle changed hands. Families rose and fell. The underground remained, sealed by ignorance rather than intention. There is something humbling about that. Power above ground shifts loudly. Below ground, it fades quietly. A curious detail appears in a few castle ruins, where underground chambers show signs of having been reopened centuries later, then sealed again. New tool marks cut through old stone. Modern curiosity meeting medieval caution. Some spaces were rediscovered, assessed, and quietly abandoned once more. Even rediscovery did not guarantee use. You stop and listen again. This part of the underground feels less stable. Not physically, but historically, it does not know who it belongs to anymore. Memory underground was fragile. It depended on continuity. When continuity broke, so did knowledge. Fires destroyed households. Plagues erased generations. Wars scattered families. A secret passed orally could vanish overnight. Some scholars question whether castles truly relied so heavily on memory for such important spaces, but the evidence suggests they did. Written records were vulnerable too. Ink burned. Parchment rotted. Memory, for all its flaws, could adapt. You think about the trust involved. Teaching someone a route like this meant trusting them not to share it, not to forget it, not to misuse it. That trust could not be enforced by walls. You imagine a child being led here once, then never again. Years later, the memory remains faint but intact, enough to guide, enough to protect. This passage feels like that, something meant to be remembered, not studied. You step carefully, aware that even now, the underground resists full understanding. It was never designed to be complete. It was designed to be sufficient. Some later historians struggle with that ambiguity. They want clear plans, clear purposes. The underground offers neither. It offers fragments. You feel that fragmentation now. A chamber that once mattered deeply, now reduced to stone and silence. Its purpose dissolved, but its presence remains. As you move on, you realize that secrecy did not end when these chambers were sealed. It continued through forgetting, through absence from maps, through silence in records. The underground survived not because it was remembered, but because it was not. And in that quiet persistence, medieval castles left behind something more enduring than stone. They left behind spaces that resisted explanation. You continue slowly, the passage curving gently, and notice a change in the stone. It is worn unevenly, suggesting footsteps that were careful, deliberate, and repeated. Here, the underground begins to feel personal, almost intimate. This is the territory of those who built it, maintained it, and occasionally entered it with heavy purpose. You pause to consider the workers who knew these spaces, builders, masons, and labourers who carved tunnels in darkness. Their knowledge was essential, yet it was dangerous to hold. A misstep could cause collapse. A loose stone could reveal secrets. They had to work with precision and discretion, balancing the risk of exposure against the necessity of progress. Historical records indicate that many laborers were selected specifically for their trustworthiness. Sometimes entire teams were sworn to secrecy, often under oath or penalty. Their expertise combined with discretion created a human lock on these underground chambers. One person's knowledge could compromise a passage. One mistake could make generations of planning irrelevant. Some chambers show evidence that they were never completed or fully used, suggesting caution sometimes outweighed ambition. Workers may have abandoned partially dug spaces if they judged them unsafe or feared discovery. Others continued with painstaking care, carving walls and ceilings slowly to avoid structural failure. The variation in construction across castles indicates that medieval people weighed risk continuously, accepting only what they deemed feasible. You run your hand along the wall, feeling the grooves left by chisels and picks. Each mark tells a story of patient labor, of people navigating darkness with determination. There is a rhythm to it, not speed, not showmanship, rhythm. Stone remembers it even centuries later. It is easy to assume that medieval underground construction relied entirely on brute strength. Archaeological evidence suggests otherwise. Small teams often accomplished what seems impossible by modern standards through careful measurement, incremental progress, and coordination. Stone was persuaded rather than shattered. Spaces were sculpted, not blasted. The logistics of this work were complex. Removing spoil from deep chambers required ingenuity, carrying stone and earth quietly through tunnels, sometimes over long distances, demanded planning. Workers developed methods to transport materials efficiently while maintaining discretion, using wheelbarrows, baskets, or simple dragging techniques. Some spoil was dispersed into gardens, while other waste was hidden in rivers or hollowed banks. These choices reveal an understanding of how perception influenced safety. The act of hiding the process was as important as the product itself. A remarkable feature in many sites is the precise alignment of tunnels with the surface above. Some corridors run directly beneath hallways or staircases, offering efficient access without exposing workers to observation. Others twist unpredictably, preventing any intruder from following. Medieval architects combined geometry, intuition, and risk assessment in ways that feel surprisingly sophisticated. You imagine a mason leading a helper through the passage in dim light, the younger worker learning each step, each turn, each hidden detail. Mistakes here could be fatal, yet they were expected to memorize everything. Skill and memory intertwined to safeguard both the chamber and its future occupants. There is also evidence that some chambers were reinforced with additional stonework in areas under heavier load. Ceilings were arched or supported with wooden beams, ensuring stability over time. Builders understood how weight and pressure could shift unpredictably, and they adjusted accordingly. The architecture is both pragmatic and adaptive, responding to natural conditions as well as anticipated human use. You notice small, shallow niches carved into the walls. These were not decorative but functional, designed to hold lamps, tools, or small items needed temporarily underground. Even the smallest choices mattered when the chamber was used in secret. Every nook and crevice served purpose. Nothing was wasted, nothing trivialized. Some scholars suggest that certain passages were intentionally confusing. Angles changed subtly. Floors rose or fell unexpectedly. A casual intruder would become disoriented quickly. Survival below ground was not only about protection but about control over movement. Every bend, every slope, every variation in height could delay or deter those who should not enter. You imagine the tension of working in such spaces. Dark, enclosed, and constantly aware of potential collapse or discovery. Masons had to balance speed with caution, curiosity with obedience. Fatigue could lead to mistakes. The consequences were severe. Their knowledge was valuable and dangerous. One wrong instruction, one slip of memory, could compromise the integrity of the entire system. Yet, despite these challenges, the chambers endured. Stone held. Designs proved robust. Work completed with care remained functional for centuries, even as the people who built them passed into history. Modern archaeologists are still uncovering evidence of ingenuity and foresight that often goes unrecognized in the shadow of castle towers and grand halls. You step forward and feel the air grow slightly cooler. Subtle differences in temperature often signaled the approach to another chamber or junction. Builders may have used these shifts consciously, understanding that human perception could guide movement in low-light conditions. The environment itself became part of the design, subtly directing behavior without instruction. There is debate among historians about whether all of these underground spaces were primarily defensive, storage-oriented, or designed for a combination of purposes. Evidence suggests the answer varies. Some chambers were clearly defensive refuges, others simple storage, and still others served more complex or symbolic roles. The overlapping functionality makes interpretation challenging, but also highlights the versatility of underground design. You stop and take a deep breath. The passage feels alive with intention. The stone, shaped by hands long gone, communicates through texture, rhythm, and placement. Every wall, every floor, every carved nook speaks of deliberate choices, patience, and expertise. In this quiet moment, you understand that the survival of these chambers depended as much on human knowledge and behavior as on architecture. Builders created space, yes, but they also created memory. They embedded instructions into walls, floors, and turns, relying on those who would follow to interpret and maintain them. This combination of skill, secrecy, and foresight ensured that underground chambers fulfilled their purpose for generations. As you move forward, the passage begins to open into a wider area, signaling that the next space will reveal yet another aspect of the castle's hidden depths. You sense the continuity of design, the thoughtfulness in every choice, and the care taken to ensure that the underground network could serve the castle, protect its people, and preserve its secrets. You step into a larger chamber, and immediately you sense absence. This room feels different from the others. It has been abandoned intentionally, its purpose unfulfilled or forgotten. The air is cooler, still, carrying only the faint trace of centuries-old stone and dust. There is no warmth here, no scent of occupation, just the quiet weight of space left to settle. Many underground chambers in medieval castles ended this way. Some were sealed before they could be used. Others fell into disuse after political turmoil, death, or changing priorities. Collapse, neglect, and deliberate closure contributed to a landscape of hidden spaces whose original functions were partially erased. These abandoned chambers tell a story not of success but of planning overtaken by circumstance. You notice how the walls bear subtle irregularities. Stonework that does not match surrounding passages. Ceilings slightly lower than intended. Floors uneven. Perhaps the chamber was left incomplete due to fear of instability. Or perhaps resources ran out. The unfinished quality is a reminder that even deliberate design was vulnerable to chance. Some researchers suggest that such spaces were initially intended for storage or temporary refuge, but were rendered obsolete when safer or more accessible chambers were completed elsewhere. Others argue that certain abandoned rooms were decoys, deliberately misleading intruders. Evidence is mixed, but patterns repeat across multiple castles, indicating a deliberate approach to underground planning. You imagine the builders standing here for the last time, deciding to stop work. Perhaps they left tools behind, partially filled baskets, or even scaffolding. Over time, those remnants disappeared, leaving only subtle signs in stone. The act of leaving was itself a form of choice, a recognition that the space would serve no immediate purpose yet might retain potential for the future. The chamber's quiet amplifies the sense of lost intention. What was once meant to support survival, concealment, or protection now exists primarily as memory embedded in stone. The walls seem to echo absence rather than function, teaching a lesson in impermanence. and the fragility of human plans. You move slowly, noticing a faint groove along the floor. Perhaps it was meant to guide water. Perhaps a track for moving supplies. Or maybe a subtle design feature intended to support a structure that was never completed. The ambiguity makes the chamber feel haunted with potential. Without documentation, its original purpose is left to speculation. Historical accounts occasionally mention chambers that were discovered centuries after abandonment, often during renovations or accidental collapses. These discoveries reveal sophisticated craftsmanship in spaces that were otherwise invisible. Builders anticipated that some chambers might never be used, yet they prepared them meticulously. With careful alignment, smooth stonework, and subtle reinforcement, even forgotten chambers retain evidence of thought and skill. You imagine the labourers who worked here briefly. Their effort may have been stopped suddenly by orders from the Lord, by the arrival of an external threat, or simply by exhaustion. The space preserves their labour as quietly as the rest of the underground, but without reward or recognition. The absence of use underscores the unpredictability of human intention versus circumstance. Some underground chambers that appear abandoned today were likely maintained in secrecy, only reopened when needed. Archaeological traces suggest that certain tunnels were reused multiple times, while others were permanently closed after a single period of occupancy. This selective use reinforces the notion that the underground network was dynamic, adapting to the evolving needs of the castle and its inhabitants. You step closer to the far wall and notice a subtle indentation. Perhaps it was intended for a door, a storage container, or an object that was never placed. Small decisions like this reveal a careful design philosophy even when the end result was incomplete. Medieval builders balanced necessity, structural limits, and secrecy in every choice, creating spaces that could serve multiple functions depending on circumstance. There is a quiet lesson in this abandoned chamber. Not all human planning reaches fulfillment. Structures built with intent may be left behind. Choices made for survival may be overtaken by events, and yet the remnants carry meaning, offering insight into thought processes, priorities, and methods of adaptation. You imagine the chamber during its hypothetical use, the cool air providing temporary relief, supplies arranged with care, occupants moving cautiously, decisions made about what to carry, what to leave, how to preserve life or property. Then you overlay that image with the reality of abandonment. The contrast is instructive. Survival is as much about recognizing when to act as when to desist. Some historians debate whether abandoned chambers were always functional in their design or sometimes intentionally incomplete. Archaeological evidence suggests both are true. The medieval mind considered contingencies, creating options that could be activated if needed. Even if a room never served its original purpose, its existence provided flexibility and potential. The act of preparing spaces that might never be used reflects strategic foresight. You walk through the chamber slowly, letting your hand brush the walls. Every groove, every surface, every uneven joint carries information about construction techniques, priorities, and human adaptation. Abandoned chambers are not failures. They are records of thought, labor, and circumstance. They embody the tension between planning and reality, between intended purpose and historical outcome. As you reach the far end, you notice a subtle exit leading to another corridor. The path ahead is narrower, more deliberate. Abandonment here does not signify finality. It is a pause, a transition, a reminder that underground networks were layered with intention. Some realized, some deferred, some lost to time. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet of the chamber settle around you. The air remains cool, the stone firm, the echoes soft. Even in absence, the space teaches patience, observation, and respect for the labor and foresight of those who built it. Not every chamber fulfills its function, but every chamber communicates its purpose, its possibility, and its presence in the shadowed architecture of survival. In this space, you understand that medieval underground chambers were not just practical, They were dynamic, responsive, and adaptable. Some fulfilled their intended roles. Others remained silent, their stories incomplete, their potential preserved in stone. And, together, all of these spaces used, abandoned, hidden, composed the full, intricate network beneath the castle, reflecting the human desire to prepare, to protect, and to endure. You continue along the corridor and notice how the stone begins to feel uneven again, not because of collapse, but because of subtle shifts that hint at age, movement, or perhaps hasty construction. This part of the underground network feels almost experimental, as if the builders were testing ideas, learning how far they could push design while maintaining secrecy and stability. Some corridors end abruptly, walls closing off without obvious purpose. Others curve unexpectedly, creating dead ends or small chambers that were likely intended for storage, observation, or temporary refuge. Archaeologists have found evidence that these irregularities were often deliberate. Builders did not simply stop in the middle of a passage, they adapted to obstacles, soil conditions, and structural demands as construction progressed. You run your hand along the wall, feeling the subtle variations in stone. Some sections are polished smooth, while others are rough, suggesting different teams or periods of work. The rhythm of labor is embedded in these surfaces. A groove here, a tool mark there, a patch where repairs were made. Each tells a story of human adaptation in a complex environment. In several castles, small niches appear in seemingly random locations. These might have held lamps, small tools, or items of value. Some may have served as markers or guides for those who knew the passages. In essence, the builders created a language in stone that only initiates could read. The underground space became a network of communication without words, where stone conveyed both direction and purpose. There is a noticeable change in air quality as you progress. The chambers ahead feel slightly cooler, drier. In other sections, moisture clings to walls and floor, hinting at historical issues with drainage or prolonged use. Medieval builders had to balance ventilation carefully. Air that is too stagnant can be dangerous, promoting illness or suffocating smoke. Air that flows too freely could carry sound or smell to unintended ears. The subtle changes you feel suggest that ventilation was considered at every stage, often disguised within walls, ceilings, or cleverly angled shafts. You imagine the tension of the builder's work. Each decision, how deep to dig, how to channel air, how to guide foot traffic, required foresight. Misjudgments could lead to collapse, flooding, or the compromise of secrecy. Even minor errors might turn an intended refuge into a hazard. Laborers had to combine intuition, experience, and observation, learning from the stone and soil as much as from prior instruction. Some historians note that knowledge of these chambers was tightly controlled. Only a few trusted individuals could navigate the full network safely. One person could compromise the entire system if they forgot a turn, misinterpreted a niche, or revealed the sequence of chambers to the wrong person. This reliance on human memory reflects a blend of trust, hierarchy, and practical necessity that governed underground life. Curiously, traces of wear are uneven. Some floors are polished in specific areas, while adjacent sections remain rough. This suggests selective usage. Perhaps certain chambers were visited more frequently, while others were almost never accessed. Some rooms may have been intended for occasional refuge during sieges, while others were primarily for storage or concealment of valuables. The patterns hint at an intricate understanding of human behavior and utility. You consider the challenge of keeping these spaces both functional and secret. Secrecy was maintained through careful planning and construction, but also through deliberate misdirection. Corridors might double back, dead ends might conceal exits, and niches might disguise the presence of doors. In this way, the underground network was a combination of architecture and psychological strategy, manipulating perception as much as controlling physical space. Some later observers questioned whether these features were intentional or the product of trial and error. Archaeological evidence suggests that both interpretations may be valid. Builders adapted to immediate conditions while simultaneously enforcing rules that reflected strategic and practical foresight. Every curve, slope, or recess had a purpose, even if that purpose was subtle or multi-layered. You notice a junction ahead where several passages converge. The layout implies planning for multiple scenarios. A group could retreat here, split into different chambers, or converge to redistribute resources or people. Even abandoned sections may have contributed to the overall flexibility of the underground network, serving as decoys or buffers against unplanned intrusions. The idea of adaptability continues as you move forward. These chambers were not static. They evolved with the castle itself, reflecting new fears, political realities, and technological knowledge. What began as storage or refuge might later be used differently as needs changed. The underground network is dynamic, shaped by both intention and circumstance. You step more cautiously, aware of the subtle shifts in floor and wall. The stone beneath you has endured centuries, absorbing the patterns of countless footsteps. You sense that the past is layered here, in ways that writing could never capture. Each passage embodies decisions, adjustments, and compromises made in real time by real people facing uncertainty. As you progress, the sense of time begins to feel elastic. The underground chambers operate by different rhythms than the world above. Light is minimal, temperature steady, and sound muted. Activities are measured, actions deliberate. Even breathing seems amplified. Here, survival requires attention, patience, and understanding of the environment as much as courage. The network teaches a final lesson in this chamber. Not all spaces were meant to be used simultaneously. Not all chambers were intended to reveal their purpose immediately. Some functioned as contingencies, others as decoys. Some were used once, others never. Flexibility was embedded in design, a reflection of medieval pragmatism and foresight. As you leave this junction, the passage narrows again, reminding you that movement underground demanded mindfulness. Every step matters. Every turn has a consequence. These corridors are more than stone. They are a dialogue between builders and future users, a testament to human ingenuity under constraint. And as you continue, you understand that the castle's underground spaces are not merely forgotten rooms or tunnels. They are living records of strategy, labor, and adaptation, resilient in their silence and enduring in their subtle sophistication. You step into a section of the underground that feels unusually expansive, almost spacious compared to the narrow corridors you have been following. The air is steadier here, slightly warmer, though still carrying the characteristic mineral scent of stone that has absorbed centuries of history. This space feels like a central node, a place where design, function, and human necessity converge. You notice immediately that the walls and floor are more even, the stone carefully cut and fitted. This suggests that the chamber had strategic significance, designed with foresight rather than improvised. The craftsmanship indicates that the builders expected it to serve multiple purposes, potentially as a hub connecting various tunnels or as a staging point during emergencies. Medieval records and archaeological evidence suggest that some of these central chambers were used for coordinating movement underground. During sieges, defenders could distribute personnel, ration supplies, and plan actions without exposing themselves to attackers above. The architecture supported human behavior, guiding people subtly with curves, elevations, and the orientation of doorways. You run your fingers along the wall, feeling the grooves and slight depressions left by countless hands over the centuries. Some of these marks are clearly functional, indicating where tools or containers rested. Others may have been left unconsciously, by people leaning or pacing. The walls themselves preserve a history of presence, an imprint of human activity that is rarely visible above ground. A curious detail appears in some chambers of this type, small alcoves or niches in the walls that seem too shallow for storage and too discreet for decorative purposes. Scholars suggest these may have served as resting places for lamps, small objects, or even as markers to navigate complex tunnel networks. The multifunctionality of design reflects both efficiency and secrecy, two principles central to the survival of castles and their inhabitants. You imagine a scenario in which this chamber is used during a siege. People descend from above, carrying essential items, guiding children and the elderly, communicating with signals or whispered instructions. Each person must navigate the space carefully, knowing that missteps could alert enemies, damage the structure, or waste precious air and light. Every movement is measured, deliberate, and purposeful. There is debate among historians regarding the degree of coordination in these underground networks. Some argue that these spaces functioned primarily as storage or simple shelters, while others contend that the chambers were designed with sophisticated planning in mind, integrating multiple functions including refuge, concealment, and communication. The evidence supports both perspectives, highlighting the adaptability of these spaces over time. You step further into the chamber and notice subtle changes in the floor's slope. Slight inclines guide movement, prevent water accumulation, and help manage the flow of people. Even minor design decisions reflect an understanding of both environmental conditions and human behavior. Medieval builders combined practicality with strategic foresight, crafting spaces that could endure both natural and human pressures. The ceiling here is higher than in other areas, providing a sense of openness while maintaining the chamber's concealment. This height allows occupants to move more freely and to store or access larger items without strain. Yet the design remains understated, avoiding attention from above or from anyone who might accidentally discover the passage. You pause and imagine the psychological impact of such a space on its users. The openness within the enclosed underground environment could provide a measure of comfort and calm, even amid fear or uncertainty. Small details, like the gentle slope of the floor, the careful alignment of walls, and the distribution of light through concealed openings, all contribute to an atmosphere that encourages patience and composure. Evidence from certain sites suggests that these chambers were also used for temporary accommodation during extended sieges. People could rest, eat, and manage supplies while remaining largely safe from external threats. Items stored here included provisions, weapons, and occasionally documents or valuables that required protection. The space was functional, yet psychologically accommodating, reflecting an understanding of human needs under duress. You notice faint discoloration on the walls and floor, suggesting repeated occupancy or movement. The patterns of wear reveal preferred pathways and frequently used areas, providing insight into how medieval people navigated and organized the chamber. These traces, though subtle, are invaluable for understanding the practical life of underground spaces. Some chambers of this kind also show evidence of later modification. Sections of walls or floors were altered, niches added or removed, reflecting changing needs over time. This adaptability underscores the dynamic nature of underground networks. They were not static but evolved with the castle and its inhabitants. You imagine returning to this chamber in the heat of a siege, hearing faint echoes of movement from other tunnels, feeling the controlled air, noting the subtle cues embedded in stone that guide behavior. Every aspect of the chamber's design is deliberate, facilitating movement, storage, concealment, and safety simultaneously. Even in the quiet, you sense the careful thought that shaped this space. Decisions about size, alignment, slope, ventilation, and concealment all contribute to a sophisticated understanding of architecture, human psychology, and survival strategy. Medieval builders were engineers, tacticians, and observers of human behavior, embedding their knowledge in stone in ways that endure centuries later. As you move toward the next junction, you feel the chamber's weight in your mind. It is more than just a room. It is a testament to foresight, adaptation, and the quiet ingenuity that made underground survival possible. The lessons it embodies are as much about human resilience and planning as they are about architecture. In this expansive chamber, You realize that medieval underground networks were designed to serve multiple generations. They provided refuge, storage, and strategic advantage. Yet they also educated occupants, shaped movement, and created psychological stability. Every stone, groove, and niche carries intention, even when centuries have passed. As you step toward the narrowing passage leading out, you carry with you an understanding of how deeply integrated design, human behavior, and environmental awareness were in these spaces. Underground chambers were not mere shelters or afterthoughts. They were living systems, dynamic and responsive, reflecting both the pragmatism and the ingenuity of their builders. You enter a section of the underground that feels unexpectedly modern in its precision. The walls are straighter, the floor smoother, and the alignment of the passage suggests careful planning. This part of the network seems designed less for improvisation and more for discovery, though discovery by authorized individuals only. It is clear that medieval architects understood the value of order in spaces that were inherently secretive. The air here is slightly fresher, hinting at ventilation shafts or subtle openings that connect to the outside. Even in these hidden corridors, movement of air was a critical consideration. Medieval builders recognized that stagnant air could cause illness, degrade stored materials, or make long-term refuge unbearable. Ventilation shafts were often cleverly concealed, disguised as drainage or structural features, so that functionality did not compromise secrecy. You run your fingers along the stone and notice the precision of the masonry. The walls fit seamlessly together, with few irregularities. Tool marks are shallow and consistent, suggesting that work was performed by skilled laborers accustomed to both discretion and accuracy. It is a level of craftsmanship that speaks to the importance placed on this segment of the underground network. Evidence from other castles shows that such well-constructed passages were often maintained over centuries. Even when surface structures changed or fell into disrepair, these sections remained functional. The durability of stonework, combined with thoughtful design, allowed underground networks to continue serving practical purposes long after their initial construction. You notice that the passage curves slightly, a gentle bend that seems unnecessary at first. This curvature is likely intentional, designed to reduce direct sight lines or to slow movement in a way that could be advantageous in case of intrusion. Medieval architects understood that subtle changes in geometry could manipulate behavior, guiding people through space without overt instruction. Some historians suggest that these precise passages served as access points for essential functions rather than for emergency refuge. They could connect storage rooms, water sources, or supply chambers to multiple areas of the castle without drawing attention. The routes allowed trusted individuals to move quietly and efficiently, preserving both safety and operational continuity. You pause and consider how these passages were learned and remembered. Unlike written records that could be stolen or destroyed, underground knowledge often relied on memory and repeated practice. Successive generations of castle staff would be guided through these corridors, gradually learning the sequence of turns, the location of niches, and the subtle cues embedded in stone. Knowledge transfer was deliberate and controlled, ensuring that critical pathways remain known only to a select few. There is a small alcove to the side, slightly recessed from the main path. Its purpose is not immediately clear. Perhaps it once held supplies, a lamp, or a protective object. Archaeologists have found similar features in multiple sites, leading them to conclude that minor variations in design were purposeful, offering flexibility while maintaining overall uniformity. The combination of standard construction and adaptable niches allowed builders to respond to different needs without compromising the integrity or secrecy of the network. As you move forward, the corridor begins to descend gently. You feel the air cool and the space tighten slightly. Though the quality of construction remains high, this suggests a controlled transition between chambers, maintaining both usability and discretion. Medieval builders were attentive to human experience, anticipating how movement, comfort, and perception would interact with the physical environment. Some chambers connected to this corridor reveal traces of long-term use-worn floors, smoothed edges on stone steps, faint discoloration where hands rested repeatedly. These subtle signs indicate that the space was not purely theoretical. People moved through it, relied upon it, and left faint traces that survive centuries later. You imagine a lord or steward walking these corridors in the quiet hours, checking supplies or confirming that hidden routes remained intact, even without external threat. Routine inspections would reinforce familiarity with the network and prevent accidents. Attention to maintenance was as important as initial construction, ensuring that the underground remained functional under changing conditions. There is evidence in some sites of intentional markings, small incisions or notches in stone, likely serving as orientation cues. They are subtle enough to escape casual notice but effective for those who knew their significance. These markers highlight the sophistication of planning. The underground network combined physical construction with mnemonic design, relying on both material and human memory to function effectively. You pause to reflect on how these corridors balance secrecy and usability. They are hidden from view, yet carefully designed to support repeated and controlled movement. Their construction reflects an understanding of both material limitations and human behavior, blending practicality with discretion in a way that is both impressive and enduring. Some scholars continue to debate whether such precise passages were common in all castles or concentrated in regions where the political or military environment demanded greater security. The evidence suggests variation. Some castles relied on simpler tunnels, while others developed extensive networks with multiple levels of access, demonstrating a high degree of adaptability. As you approach the end of this corridor, you notice a subtle shift in light and air. This signals a connection to another chamber, one likely used for important activities or storage. The transition is smooth, deliberate, and concealed, reflecting the careful attention medieval builders paid to experience and function. Even in spaces meant to be hidden, movement was managed thoughtfully. You step forward, feeling the continuity of the underground network and appreciating the integration of architecture, human behavior, and strategic design. This space, precise and well-maintained, exemplifies how medieval castles combined durability, secrecy, and adaptability to meet the complex demands of survival and control. You continue deeper into the network, the air growing cooler and slightly drier as you progress. The passage here feels narrower, tighter, yet purposeful, as though every inch has been shaped to serve multiple functions while maintaining secrecy. This is a space where practical necessity and strategic foresight converge, revealing the intelligence behind medieval underground construction. You notice immediately that the stonework is highly uniform. Each block fits seamlessly with its neighbors, minimizing gaps and potential weak points. Archaeological studies indicate that this level of precision was intended to strengthen the chamber against shifting soil, vibrations, and accidental damage. Even minor deviations could compromise structural integrity, so care and consistency were essential. As you move forward, you become aware of faint air currents. Medieval builders, though lacking modern understanding of ventilation, clearly understood the importance of airflow. The placement of narrow shafts and concealed openings suggests they observed natural movement of air and adapted accordingly, allowing fresh air to circulate without revealing the chamber's presence. This subtle attention to environmental detail ensured that occupants could survive for extended periods underground without suffocating or suffering the effects of stagnant air. Your hand brushes against a small recess carved into the wall. Its purpose is not immediately apparent. It could have held a lamp, a small storage container, or even a symbolic item meant to reassure those waiting below. Similar niches appear throughout the underground network, often in locations that maximize concealment while remaining accessible to those familiar with the layout. The versatility of these features indicates careful planning and an understanding of human behavior. You consider the human dimension of this design. Underground spaces required discipline and coordination. People moving through narrow passages had to do so quietly, deliberately, and with awareness of each other's presence. Any misstep could alert enemies or cause accidents. Even in the absence of immediate threat, the architecture enforced caution and attention. Subtle cues in the stone, floor, and walls guided movement, teaching occupants how to navigate the environment safely. There is evidence that some corridors were used more frequently than others, suggested by polished areas on the floor and worn edges along the walls. These high-traffic routes likely connected key chambers, allowing trusted personnel to move efficiently while maintaining secrecy. In contrast, lesser-used passages remained rough and uneven, serving as contingencies or storage areas. This differentiation reflects strategic thinking, balancing accessibility with concealment. You notice that the passage curves gently at intervals. These curves serve multiple purposes. They conceal direct lines of sight, create sound buffers, and slow movement to prevent hurried mistakes. In this way, the architecture itself regulates behavior, subtly enforcing safety and discretion. Medieval builders understood that space could be a tool, shaping actions as effectively as doors or walls. A curious detail emerges in several sites, shallow notches along the edges of walls, likely used as markers for navigation or alignment. They are unobtrusive but functional, providing orientation cues for those who knew how to interpret them. These subtle features underscore the complexity of the network, blending physical construction with an unspoken system of guidance. You imagine a lord or steward descending these corridors during a period of unrest, moving between chambers to inspect supplies, check on hidden treasures, or coordinate personnel. Every step is deliberate, every movement measured. Even with familiarity, caution is essential. The passage demands attention, patience, and memory. Some historians debate how extensively these spaces were used over time. Certain chambers appear to have seen little occupancy, while others were actively maintained and frequently accessed. The network's adaptability allowed it to serve multiple generations, with spaces repurposed as needs changed. Flexibility was integral to its design. You step into a junction where multiple passages converge. The layout suggests strategic planning for contingencies, providing options for diversion, concealment, or escape. Occupants could choose different paths depending on circumstances. Yet the overall network maintained control and order. This ability to accommodate multiple scenarios reflects an advanced understanding of both architecture and human behavior. There is subtle evidence that some passages were periodically modified, stone blocks repositioned, minor walls reinforced, niches added or altered. These adjustments indicate ongoing maintenance and adaptation, ensuring the network remained functional as conditions changed above and below ground. The builders anticipated that time would alter both stone and circumstance, and they planned accordingly. You pause to consider the psychological effect of these spaces. They were quiet, constrained, and deliberately obscured, yet they provided structure, organization, and guidance, fostering a sense of control in otherwise unpredictable situations. Occupants could navigate, act, and survive, even amid external threats or uncertainty. Even in silence, the network communicates intention. The precision of construction, the placement of niches, the orientation of passages all signal deliberate choice. The underground spaces were not haphazard or purely reactive. They were designed, maintained, and adapted with foresight. Human ingenuity persists in the subtle geometry of stone and the hidden logic of layout. As you move forward through this junction, you understand that medieval underground networks were living systems. They responded to human needs, environmental conditions, and potential threats. They were resilient, adaptable, and functional, balancing secrecy with usability, discretion with accessibility. Every element, from the curvature of a passage to the placement of a notch, reflects intelligence, skill, and the necessity of survival. And as you continue deeper into the castle's subterranean heart, you realize that these spaces are more than historical curiosities. They are enduring records of human problem-solving, vigilance, and foresight, silently preserved in stone for centuries. You continue moving through the underground network, and a sense of quiet reflection settles over you. This part of the castle feels older, less touched by maintenance or renovation. The stone is rougher here, uneven in places, and the walls bear faint discolorations from centuries of exposure. There is an air of endurance, of survival through time rather than activity. As you progress, you notice that the passages begin to narrow again. This narrowing is not accidental. In medieval design, constricted spaces controlled movement. They slowed people down, limited the number of individuals passing at once, and enhanced security. Even today, you are reminded that underground chambers were about regulation as much as concealment. You reach a junction where several small corridors converge. The layout suggests deliberate planning for flexibility. Multiple routes could be taken depending on circumstances above. Historical accounts indicate that lords and stewards relied on these configurations during sieges or emergencies, directing personnel to different chambers or coordinating the distribution of supplies without exposing themselves to danger. The architecture itself became a guide for action. The walls show subtle tool marks, indicating skilled labor. Some marks are deep and precise, while others are lighter and uneven. These variations likely reflect different teams of builders or phases of construction. Archaeological evidence suggests that underground networks were often expanded or modified over decades, adapting to changing needs and evolving threats. The laborers who carved these spaces had to combine technical skill with discretion, ensuring that the chambers remained functional while maintaining secrecy. Air circulation remains consistent, a sign of thoughtful ventilation. Narrow shafts connect to upper levels. Though their placement is nearly invisible, medieval builders understood, through observation and trial, that stagnant air could be dangerous. Subtle openings allowed fresh air to circulate without compromising concealment, a delicate balance between necessity and secrecy. Evidence shows that these ventilation shafts were carefully disguised, often integrated into wall structures or drainage features, highlighting the ingenuity of their design. You run your fingers along a section of the wall that bears a slight depression. It is faint, worn by repeated contact over centuries. These depressions may have served as markers, resting spots for tools, or guides for navigation. They are reminders that the underground was not only a physical space but also a system of knowledge, where subtle cues helped maintain order and functionality. Some passages display slight curves and angles that appear unnecessary at first glance. Yet, these features served multiple purposes. Curves could obscure direct sightlines, delay unauthorized entry, or improve acoustics. Angled turns could control movement, requiring attention and care from those navigating the chambers. Medieval builders understood that the behavior of humans and the flow of air and sound could be influenced by the geometry of space itself. You imagine the daily routines of those who use these chambers. Small groups moving quietly, carrying supplies, checking on stored goods, or ensuring that pathways remained clear. Every step required attention, as even minor mistakes could compromise the utility or secrecy of the space. Historical accounts suggest that during periods of siege, these routines became essential for maintaining organization and calm among occupants. Some chambers contained small niches, perfectly positioned for lighting, storage, or markers. Others reveal traces of wear on the floor where movement was frequent. These details indicate that underground spaces were actively used, not merely constructed as theoretical refuges. They combined practicality, adaptability, and foresight to serve a variety of functions over time. You pause and reflect on the psychological impact of these spaces. The underground network required discipline and patience. Silence was enforced by design, not by command. The narrow corridors, low ceilings, and muted acoustics guided behavior, teaching occupants to move carefully, breathe deliberately, and conserve energy. Even today, you can sense how these features encourage attentiveness and restraint. There is evidence that some passages were repurposed multiple times throughout the castle's history. What began as storage might later serve as temporary refuge, a secure route, or even a place for valuable documents. This adaptability underscores the dynamic nature of underground networks. They were living systems, responding to changing needs, threats, and human activity. Historical debates continue about whether certain chambers were designed primarily for safety, storage, or concealment. The evidence is ambiguous, and likely all three purposes were considered in varying degrees. Some chambers may have been more symbolic, intended to convey preparedness and control without ever being fully utilized. Others were essential for the day-to-day functioning and defense of the castle. As you move forward, the passages remain purposeful but subtle, integrating practical design with human needs. Every curve, notch, and niche reflects careful thought. Even in spaces that now appear silent or abandoned, the legacy of their design persists. The underground chambers endure as evidence of medieval ingenuity, resilience, and attention to detail. You reach a slightly larger room, open enough to suggest coordination or storage, yet still hidden from view. It is a reminder that the network was comprehensive, accommodating multiple scenarios, and adaptable across generations. The combination of concealment, functionality, and foresight demonstrates that these spaces were not static relics, but dynamic systems embedded in the very architecture of survival. Moving toward the next junction, you understand that underground chambers reflect a balance between visibility and secrecy, human control and natural limitation. They are products of observation, planning, and experience. Their design is a testament to the medieval understanding of space, movement, and survival. You step into the final major chamber of this underground network, and immediately a sense of conclusion settles over the space. It is larger than any you have traversed, with a ceiling high enough to stand fully upright and walls meticulously finished. The air feels slightly warmer here, hinting at subtle ventilation from hidden shafts that bring in fresh air. This chamber was clearly designed as a central hub, a place where critical functions converged. The floor is even, with faint wear marks indicating repeated foot traffic. Historical evidence suggests that chambers like this were multi-purpose storage for essential supplies, temporary refuge for key individuals, or a coordination point during emergencies. The design reflects foresight and adaptability. Builders understood that underground networks had to be versatile to remain useful under different conditions. You run your fingers along the walls, noticing tool marks left by skilled laborers. The marks are consistent and precise, showing care and attention. In some areas, niches were carved to hold lamps, small items, or even markers to guide movement. These subtle details highlight the interplay between practical function and discrete guidance. Every feature had purpose, and even centuries later, the craftsmanship conveys intent. You pause to reflect on how people would have used this space. Families, servants, or soldiers might have descended into these chambers during sieges, fires, or other emergencies. The design ensured that movement was controlled, noise minimized, and resources accessible. Ventilation shafts maintained air quality, niches provided organization, and the architecture itself enforced careful behavior. Evidence from multiple castle sites suggests that knowledge of these spaces was tightly controlled. Only a few trusted individuals would know the full layout, while others might learn partial routes sufficient for their role. Memory, training, and observation were essential. The success of the underground network depended not only on construction, but also on human discipline and knowledge transfer. You notice subtle curves in the walls, strategic turns that serve multiple purposes. They break lines of sight, control movement, and reduce echoes. The passage design anticipates behavior, influencing how people navigate space without overt instruction. Medieval builders understood that the physical environment could guide action as effectively as orders. Some chambers of this type contain traces of long-term maintenance, stone blocks replaced, niches reinforced, floors smoothed. This suggests ongoing use and care. Even if a chamber was not frequently occupied, its presence had strategic value. Periodic inspections ensured that the network remained functional, ready to serve multiple generations. You imagine the psychological effect of occupying this chamber. Silence, darkness, and confinement might have been unsettling. Yet the design provides reassurance. Clear lines, predictable spaces, and subtle environmental cues fostered calm and order. Occupants could navigate with confidence, even under stress. A curious detail appears in certain areas, small marks or notches that likely served as orientation cues. They are subtle, visible only to those familiar with their meaning. These markers illustrate the integration of memory and design, allowing the underground network to function efficiently while remaining hidden. As you move toward the far side of the chamber, you notice slight discolorations in the stone. These traces reveal patterns of use, pathways most frequently traveled, and areas designated for temporary storage or congregation. Even abandoned chambers retain evidence of human interaction, preserving memory in stone. The chamber's scale and finish suggest that it was intended for critical functions. Supplies could be organized, people could gather, and communication could occur with minimal risk of exposure. The combination of concealment, accessibility, and adaptability demonstrates the sophistication of medieval underground planning. You take a moment to consider the broader network. This final chamber connects passages leading to storage rooms, escape routes, and smaller refuges. The design integrates multiple priorities: survival, discretion, strategic advantage, and human needs. Every chamber contributes to the overall functionality, creating a coherent, adaptable system. Historical accounts indicate that some underground networks evolved over decades. Adapting to changing threats and requirements, chambers initially designed for storage could later serve as temporary refuge or coordination spaces. This dynamic approach reflects an understanding that architecture must respond to circumstances, a principle evident in the careful craftsmanship and layout of the network. As you move through this chamber, you sense the balance between visibility and concealment. Every feature is intentional. Niches, curves, ventilation, and floor slopes combine to create a system that is functional, adaptable, and secure. The medieval builders designed not only with stone but with foresight, psychology, and environmental understanding. You pause one last time, taking in the quiet of the space. It embodies the principles that govern the underground network: flexibility, discretion, durability, and human-centered design. Every decision, from material selection to corridor curvature, reflects strategic thinking and attention to detail. And as you prepare to leave this central hub, you understand that the underground chambers of medieval castles were more than mere hiding places. They were dynamic systems, integrating architecture, human behavior, and environmental awareness to serve multiple generations. They preserved lives, possessions, and strategic advantage while remaining largely invisible to those above ground. In the stillness of this final chamber, you feel the full scope of medieval ingenuity. The network embodies foresight, patience, and adaptation. It survives in stone, air, and memory, teaching lessons about resourcefulness, human behavior, and resilience that endure long after the castles themselves have faded. You move slowly out of the final chamber, letting the cool, still air of the underground settle around you. The echoes of your footsteps fade into silence, as if the castle itself has exhaled after centuries of vigilance. The stone walls, worn smooth in places and rough in others, carry the memory of countless hands that carved, maintained, and navigated these hidden corridors. Every curve, niche, and junction speaks of human ingenuity, patience, and adaptation. You pause to reflect on the lessons held in these subterranean spaces, They are more than storage rooms or secret refuges. They are living systems, carefully calibrated to protect, sustain, and guide. Air flows subtly, guiding movement. Light penetrates only where necessary. Sound is muted. Yet patterns remain perceptible to those who know how to listen. Medieval builders understood not only stone and earth, but people, their needs, their fears, and their resilience. Each chamber, corridor, and hidden nook embodies a sophisticated balance of practicality, discretion, and foresight. In imagining life here, you feel the weight of survival in a world shaped by uncertainty. Children learned stillness, adults measured every action, and families navigated fear with patience. Hunger, cold, and confinement were challenges, yet the architecture worked with them, not against them. Underground chambers were both a sanctuary and a teacher, reinforcing careful movement, quiet reflection, and awareness of one's environment. Even the abandoned or incomplete spaces carry meaning. They remind us that not all plans are fully realized, yet every effort leaves a trace. Labor, intention, and anticipation are preserved in the stone, offering insight into centuries of thought and strategy. These chambers illustrate that preparation, flexibility, and understanding the limits of the material world were as vital as courage or strength above ground. As you walk toward the final exit, the air warms slightly. Sunlight filtering faintly from above, you feel the contrast between the underground world and the life waiting outside. Time in these chambers was measured differently, slower, more deliberate, and attentive. The experience teaches lessons in patience, mindfulness, and the quiet power of foresight. Leaving the underground, you carry with you the awareness that medieval castles were as much about what lay beneath as what stood above. The chambers, passages, and hidden refuges reflect a nuanced understanding of survival, human behavior, and environmental design. They were spaces of secrecy and strategy, of care and adaptation, enduring silently as testaments to ingenuity and resilience. Now, as you step into open air and let the sunlight wash over you, the lessons of the underground remain: silence, patience, foresight, and subtlety shaped survival in ways that are easy to overlook but impossible to ignore. You carry the echo of stone, the guidance of carefully measured passages, and the memory of lives lived quietly beneath the surface. The underground chambers of medieval castles endure as symbols not only of secrecy and defense, but of the human capacity to adapt, plan, and protect. They remind us that resilience often works in silence, that preparation matters more than drama, and that ingenuity thrives even where it is unseen. In their quiet, steadfast presence, these spaces whisper of survival, patience, and the enduring lessons of foresight. Sweet dreams,